There is a kind of cold that does not come from the winter frost, but from the slow, quiet settling of shadows. If you close your eyes and listen to the breathing of the past, you can almost feel how the world used to be, just before the long night fell. Picture a continent bathed in the soft, golden light of late afternoon. In countless small towns and ancient, sprawling cities, the rhythm of life hummed with a simple, beautiful predictability. It was the gentle clatter of teacups on wooden tables. It was the smell of damp earth after a spring rain, mingling with the sweet, heavy scent of bread baking in corner shops. It was the sound of children's laughter echoing down narrow, cobblestone alleyways, bouncing off walls that had stood for centuries, watching generations come and go. In those days, the worries of the world were small and tender. A mother sat by a window, carefully mending the worn heel of a woolen sock, her thoughts drifting to her son's journey to school in the morning chill. A father dipped his pen into ink, writing a letter to a distant friend, filling the pages with mundane, precious details about the changing of the leaves, the health of the family dog, the quiet hopes for the coming new year. People lived their lives in the warm, comforting glow of the ordinary. They found their shelter in the familiar faces of their neighbors, and the shared nods across a crowded market, and the simple grace of walking home under a sky scattered with stars. But then, the wind began to change. It did not arrive as a sudden, roaring storm that tore the roofs from the houses. No, it came like a creeping draft under the doorline, a subtle chill that settled into the bones before anyone truly realized the temperature had dropped. At first, it was only a feeling, a vague, unspoken unease that drifted through the marketplaces and hovered over the dinner tables. The evening newspapers began to carry words that felt heavy, words that made the readers quietly fold the pages and look out their windows with a furrowed brow. The lights in the towns began to dim. It happened slowly, house by house, street by street. Families began to draw their heavy curtains a little earlier in the evening, shutting out the twilight, as if by closing the fabric they could keep the gathering darkness at bay. The joyous, chaotic noise of the town squares gradually quieted to a hushed murmur. People still met, they still spoke, but their voices dropped to a softer register. They began to look over their shoulders. They began to wonder who might be listening in the shadows. The world was holding its breath, waiting for a dawn that seemed to be slipping further and further away. And from this gathering mist, from this chilling wind, emerged a man who seemed entirely made of the cold. He was not a man of fiery rage or loud, chaotic anger. Those things, though destructive, still contain a spark of human heat. This man was different. He moved through the world like a figure carved from polished ice. He was impeccably sharp, utterly precise, and terrifyingly silent in his soul. Those who stood near him often felt a strange, invisible frost, a deep and unsettling void where a human heart should have been beating. He understood the mechanics of the world perfectly. He knew how to play the violin, his fingers moving across the strings with flawless, calculated precision. The notes would rise into the air, mathematically perfect, exquisitely sharp. But there was no weeping in his music. There was no joy, no sorrow, no memory of a lost love or a distant summer. He possessed a profound ability to understand human nature, but only as a clockmaker understands the gears and springs of a watch. He saw people not as breathing, dreaming souls, but as pieces on a vast, silent chessboard. He saw their fears, their loves, and their loyalties merely as levers to be pulled, equations to be solved, and obstacles to be quietly, efficiently removed. To him, the warm, messy, beautiful reality of human life was an irrelevance. The tear rolling down a frightened mother's cheek was simply a reaction of salt and water. The defiant gaze of a proud father was merely a temporary miscalculation of power. He was an architect of shadows, a man who built immense, towering structures of control without ever dirtying his hands with the soil of the earth. He was called many things in whispered voices, but the truth of his nature was simpler and far more devastating. He was a man utterly devoid of empathy. He was a winter that did not end. As his influence spread, as his invisible, icy hand extended across the map, the ordinary people felt the grip tighten around their lives. It is a profound and terrifying thing to realize that the world you have known is slipping away, not by the forces of nature, but by the deliberate design of other men. Imagine the feeling of waking up in your own bed, in the room you have slept in since you were a child, and realizing that the walls no longer belong to you. Imagine walking down your own street, passing the bakery where you bought your wedding cake, the park where you first learned to ride a bicycle, and feeling entirely like a stranger in a foreign, hostile land. This was the quiet heartbreak that swept across the continent. It was the sorrow of 1,000 small, invisible farewells. In the dim light of their kitchens, families began to practice the art of disappearance. They learned to hide their favorite books beneath the floorboards, carefully wrapping the fragile pages in oilcloth to protect them from the damp. They learned to speak in codes, using gentle, innocuous words to mask the desperate, frantic beating of their hearts. They packed away their bright clothes and their loud music. A grand piano in the corner of a living room, once the center of joyous holiday gatherings, was carefully covered with a heavy sheet, sitting in the gloom like a silent ghost, its keys cold and untouched. There is a particular kind of heroism that is never recorded in the history books. It is not the heroism of raising a flag on a battlefield or standing tall before a firing squad. It is the quiet, agonizing heroism of the everyday. It is the mother who forces a warm, reassuring smile onto her face as she hands her children their meager breakfast, swallowing her own terror so that they might feel safe for one more hour. It is the postman who carefully memorizes the addresses of those in danger, carrying the burden of their secrets in his mind so that nothing is ever written down. It is the neighbor who leaves a single, precious potato on the doorstep of a family whose father was taken away in the night, a silent, invisible gesture of solidarity in a world that has outlawed kindness. As the shadow stretched further eastward, it eventually fell upon a city made of gold and stone. A city of 100 spires, where the river flowed gently under ancient bridges lined with silent, watchful statues. This was a place where music seemed to rise from the very cobblestones, a city of poets and dreamers, of ancient legends and deep, abiding pride. When the chill wind finally swept through these winding streets, the transformation was profoundly sorrowful. The vibrant cafes, once filled with the clinking of glasses and the passionate, late-night debates of students and artists, grew hollow and empty. The heavy wooden doors were locked tight. The windows were taped across with paper to keep the glass from shattering. The people walked with their heads bowed, their collars turned up against the wind, their eyes fixed firmly on the ground before them. Yet, beneath the heavy blanket of fear, a faint, stubborn pulse continued to beat. The man of ice believed that if you plunged a room into absolute darkness, the light was gone forever. But he did not understand the nature of the human spirit. He did not know that a heart, even when frozen in terror, still remembers the warmth of the sun. In the privacy of their heavily curtained rooms, the people held onto their humanity like a delicate, flickering ember. They whispered the old stories to their children. They hummed the forbidden songs under their breath while they washed the dishes. They looked at old, fading photographs of happier days, tracing the faces of their loved ones with gentle, trembling fingers, keeping the memory of love alive in a time of profound hatred. The night was settling deeply over the world. The chill wind was howling at the glass, rattling the window frames, threatening to blow out the last remaining candles. Outside, the streets belonged to the shadow, to the marching boots, to the cold, calculating gaze of a man who felt nothing at all. But inside, behind the locked doors and the drawn curtains, the quiet, resilient breathing of ordinary people continued. They were frightened. They were tired. But they were waiting. And in the deep, silent dark, they held each other's hands, and they refused to let the embers die. Have you ever pressed your palm against a pane of glass in the absolute dead of winter, feeling the way it quietly steals the warmth straight from your skin? There are some souls who walk through this world in exactly that way. They do not arrive with the roar of a storm or the fiery heat of anger. Instead, they exist as a perfect, pristine absence of warmth. They are beautifully structured, flawlessly smooth, and entirely hollow. If you were to look at the life of the man they would come to fear so deeply, you would not see a monster of myth, breathing smoke and fury. You would see a man of polished glass. You would see a tall, crisp figure moving silently down long, carpeted hallways, his steps measured and even, never rushed, never hesitant. He was a man who understood the intricate mechanics of human existence, but who had never once felt the tender, beating rhythm of a human heart. Consider, for a moment, the hands of this man. They were elegant hands, long and pale. In the quiet evenings, he would sometimes take up a wooden violin, tucking it beneath his chin with practiced grace. He would draw the bow across the strings, and the notes that filled the room would be mathematically perfect. Every pitch was exact. Every tempo was flawless. He could play the great, sweeping compositions of the old masters, pulling the melody through the air like a silver thread. But there was no soul in the wood when he played. If you sat in the parlor and closed your eyes, the music did not make you weep for a lost love, nor did it make you dream of the sun rising over a quiet meadow. It was just sound. It was an equation solved in the air, brilliant and cold. He understood that music was supposed to evoke sorrow or joy, but he understood it only as a concept, the way a person born entirely without sight might understand the definition of the color blue. He knew the shape of human emotion, but he could never feel its weight. This was the terrifying tragedy of his nature. He looked at the vast, messy, beautiful tapestry of human life, the tangled threads of mothers and sons, of secret hopes, of sudden laughter in the rain, and he saw only a sprawling, disorganized machine that needed to be neatly aligned. To a person with a beating heart, a city is a living thing. It is the smell of roasted chestnuts on a corner, the sight of a stray dog sleeping in a patch of sunlight, the sound of a choir practicing through an open church window. But to the man of polished glass, a city was merely a grid on a map. People were not breathing, dreaming creatures, they were paper files. They were names typed onto small, rectangular index cards, stacked neatly in wooden drawers. Imagine the vast, quiet rooms where his orders were carried out. Picture the dust motes dancing in the pale light filtering through the high windows. In these rooms sat ordinary clerks and typists, ordinary men and women who went home at night to feed their cats or mend their children's sweaters. They sat at heavy iron typewriters, their fingers striking the keys, translating the cold wool of the man of glass into ink on paper. There is a profound, quiet terror in those rooms. Imagine a young secretary, her hair pinned back neatly, her eyes tired. She watches him walk past her desk. He does not yell. He does not scowl. He merely glances at her with eyes that have been described by so many as pale, unblinking mirrors. When you looked into his eyes, you did not see a person looking back. You saw only your own reflection, distorted by the frost. The young secretary holds her breath until he turns the corner. Her hands tremble just slightly as she feeds another sheet of paper into the carriage. She is typing a list of names. To him, this list is a simple task of subtraction, a tidying up of the numbers. But she knows, in her quiet, aching heart, that every name is a universe. She knows that the name Karel belongs to an old man who grows tomatoes on his balcony. She knows that the name Anna belongs to a girl who is learning to play the piano, her small fingers stumbling over the same warm melodies that the man of glass plays with such cold perfection. In the shadow of such profound emptiness, even the smallest act of feeling becomes a monumental heroism. When the man of glass is not looking, perhaps the secretary's hand slips. Perhaps a card is misfiled, slipping quietly to the very back of a dark wooden drawer, hidden away from the light. It is a tiny, invisible defiance. A silent whisper of humanity in a room built to extinguish it. She finishes her work, puts on her heavy woolen coat, and walks out into the falling snow. She takes off her glove just to touch the rough, imperfect bark of a tree on her walk home, grounding herself in the tactile, living world, reminding herself that she is still alive, still warm, still capable of love. The man of polished glass did not understand this quiet resistance. He believed that if you built a system perfect enough, if you calculated every variable and eliminated every flaw, you could control the very beating of the human heart. He viewed his life as a fencing match. He was a master of the foil, dressing in pristine white, hiding his face behind a wire mesh mask. On the narrow strip, he moved with lethal grace, advancing and retreating, calculating angles and distances. To him, the person holding the other sword was not a fellow sportsman. They were merely an obstacle, a puzzle of geometry to be dismantled with a swift, clean thrust. He took this masked choreography out into the world. He fenced with nations. He parried with the lives of millions. And because he felt no empathy, he was never burdened by doubt. Doubt is the heavy, human anchor that comes from caring about the consequences of your actions. When you do not care, when you cannot feel the sorrow of the weeping mother or the terror of the condemned father, you are free to be perfectly, utterly ruthless. You are unburdened by the weight of a conscience. As he rose higher into the dark architecture of his world, the chill he cast grew wider. The files multiplied. The wooden cabinets stretched down longer and longer hallways. The ink flowed like a dark, silent river. And everywhere his influence reached, the warmth began to retreat. It is difficult to comprehend a mind so devoid of light. We spend our lives trying to understand the people around us. We look for the common ground. We look for the shared smile, the mutual tear, the universal sigh of exhaustion at the end of a long day. We rely on the unspoken promise that, beneath our differences, we are all made of the same fragile, feeling clay. But with him, there was no clay. There was only the smooth, unyielding surface of the mirror. Those who worked closest to him learned to speak softly, to move carefully, as if walking on a frozen pond that might shatter at any moment. They saw how he could sign a paper that would alter the destiny of 1,000 families, and then neatly recap his fountain pen, carefully align the edges of the blotter on his desk, and ask for a cup of tea. His voice was always calm, high-pitched, and meticulously polite. The politeness was perhaps the most chilling part of all. It was the manners of a machine, performing a programmed courtesy while dismantling a life. Yet, even as this man of glass cast his long, freezing shadow across the continent, he could not entirely freeze the earth beneath him. The world is stubborn. People are stubborn. In the dim apartments and the hushed marketplaces, the human spirit continued its quiet, desperate work. A tailor sewing a coat would carefully double-stitch the lining, hoping it would keep a stranger warm on a long, dark journey. A baker would slip an extra piece of bread into a child's hands, a silent nod passing between him and the child's mother. These acts were not grand. They did not echo through history with the blast of trumpets. But they were everything. They were the friction that generated heat in a freezing world. They were the soft, woolen blankets thrown over the sharp edges of the glass. The man of unfeeling ice looked out from his high windows, seeing a continent he believed he was mastering. He saw lines on maps, railway schedules, and tidy reports of compliance. He did not see the hidden tears. He did not hear the whispered prayers. He did not know that a heart can be broken into 1,000 pieces, and still, somehow, continue to love. And soon, his pale, unblinking eyes would turn their gaze toward a city of ancient stone and winding river. He would look toward a place where the people held their music and their memories close to their chests. He would pack his crisp uniforms, his fountain pens, and his hollow wooden violin, preparing to carry his absolute winter into the very heart of the Golden City. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a city when it realizes it has been taken captive. It does not arrive with a deafening crash, nor does it announce itself with the sudden, violent shattering of glass. Instead, it comes like a heavy snowfall in the dead of night, descending softly, flake by flake, muffling the familiar, comforting sounds of life until everything is terribly, beautifully still. Imagine standing in the heart of Prague, the Golden City, in the gentle days before the frost settled in completely. The air in those days used to carry a perpetual, joyful hum. If you walked along the curving banks of the Vltava River as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of apricot and lavender, you would hear the very soul of the city spilling out from open windows. Prague was a city built of music and memory. The ancient cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, seemed to hold the rhythm of a waltz beneath your feet. From the open doorways of small, warmly lit cafes, the rich notes of a piano would drift into the evening street, mingling with the aroma of roasted coffee and sweet, rising dough. You could hear a solitary cello practicing in a high attic room, the deep, mournful melody soaring out over the rust-red rooftops. It was a place where people did not merely exist alongside one another, they felt the pulse of the world together. Friends would meet under the intricate face of the ancient astronomical clock, their easy laughter echoing against the old stone walls. Lovers would stroll arm in arm across the Charles Bridge, stopping to trace the outlines of the darkened statues with their fingertips, whispering promises into the gentle breeze. It was a city that breathed, a city that sang. But then, the shadow stretched its long, cold fingers across the ancient spires. The transition was agonizingly quiet. The people of Prague stood in their living rooms, the brass handles of their windows feeling suddenly like ice beneath their palms, and they peeked out from behind heavy, embroidered lace curtains. They watched, holding their breath, as the color was slowly drained from their beloved streets. Down below, the familiar, comforting clatter of the baker's wooden cart and the bright, calling voices of neighbors were replaced by a new sound. It was the rhythmic, mechanical thud of heavy boots on the cobblestones. The vehicles that began to roll through the ancient squares did not belong there. They were sharp, angular, moving with a stiff, unnatural rigidity that made the heart sink. In a narrow, winding alley near the old town square, there lived an elderly man whose hands were permanently stained with the deep brown varnish of his trade. For 40 years, he had been a maker of violins. His tiny, cluttered shop smelled warmly of aged maple, pine rosin, and melting beeswax. Every morning, he would gently tap the raw wood with his knuckles, listening closely to its resonance, searching for the perfect voice hidden within the timber. He believed that every piece of wood had a song waiting to be set free. But as the new reality set in, as the shadow deepened over his city, a profound heaviness settled into his shoulders. He did not smash his instruments in anger. He did not cry out. Instead, with a quiet, breaking heart, he sat at his workbench and carefully loosened the strings of his finest, nearly finished violin, relieving the tension on the wood. He wrapped the instrument in a piece of soft, faded velvet, and laid it gently in its case, like tucking in a sleeping child. He snapped the latches shut, locked the case, and pushed it far beneath his desk into the dark. The music, he decided in the quiet of his shop, must sleep until it was safe to wake again. Across the city, in a small apartment overlooking the dark waters of the river, a mother knelt beside her young daughter. The child was standing on her tiptoes, looking toward the window, drawn by the strange, unnatural quiet that had fallen over the street outside. The mother gently placed her warm hands on the girl's small shoulders and turned her away from the glass. "We must speak softly now, my little bird," the mother whispered, her voice trembling just enough to betray the fear she was trying so desperately to hide. "The walls are very tired, and we must not wake them." She reached up and pulled the heavy woolen drapes shut, plunging the sunlit room into a premature, heavy twilight. It was in these thousands of drawn curtains, and these millions of hushed words, that the true occupation began. It was a retreat into the shadows, a shrinking of the world until it was no larger than the space between four walls. The home, once a place of open doors and welcoming light, became a fortress of whispered secrets. The everyday routines that once brought such profound comfort now carried a quiet undercurrent of dread. When a father left for work in the morning, putting on his worn overcoat and adjusting his hat, the goodbye at the front door lingered just a few seconds longer than it used to. The embrace was just a fraction tighter. There was a new, unspoken understanding, hovering heavy in the air between loved ones, that the world outside their door was no longer theirs. The cafes still opened, and they still served dark, bitter coffee, but the piano sat in the corner, its lid closed tight, gathering a thin layer of dust. The patrons sat at the small round tables with hunched shoulders, their conversations reduced to hushed murmurs that barely carried across the room. No one met the eyes of strangers anymore. If someone dropped a spoon, the sudden clatter would make the whole room flinch. Trust, which was once so freely given in this city of artists and dreamers, had suddenly become a dangerous, fragile luxury. The people did not need to see the face of the man who now ruled them to feel his terrifying presence. The man of polished glass, the architect of this vast and suffocating quiet, had cast his invisible net over the entire city. His decrees were printed on sterile, white posters, pasted onto the beautiful old walls, but his true power was the invisible, crushing weight he placed on every chest. He was trying to erase the very thing that made Prague breathe. He wanted a city of obedient ghosts, a place where the machinery of his empire hummed smoothly, but where the human soul had been neatly, efficiently extracted. Yet, if you looked very closely, past the drawn curtains and the bowed heads, you would see that the soul of the city refused to vanish entirely. It simply changed its shape. The resistance of the human spirit is not always found in acts of grand, loud defiance. More often, it is found in the quiet, desperate, beautiful preservation of humanity. It was found in the tear that slipped down a grandmother's lined cheek as she stood in a long, silent line for bread, watching the foreign guards patrol the square. Her tear fell silently onto the cold cobblestones, mingling with the morning dew, unnoticed by the men with the rifles. Those tears were not a sign of surrender. They were the physical manifestation of a love so deep it physically hurt, a fierce, enduring love for a home that was being held captive. Think of the everyday heroism that goes entirely unrecorded by history. Think of the schoolteacher who, behind a carefully locked classroom door, whispered a forbidden, ancient poem to her students, keeping the language and the history of their people alive in the minds of the young. Think of the tram conductor who, seeing a terrified man step aboard without the proper papers, pretended to look out the window, giving a silent, almost imperceptible nod that allowed the man to slip off at the next stop and disappear safely into the morning mist. These were the invisible threads holding the fractured city together. It was a grand tapestry woven from tiny, terrifying moments of kindness, performed by ordinary, frightened people whose hands shook even as they did what was right. In the long, dark evenings, by the dim light of solitary lamps, people sat at their kitchen tables and wrote letters they knew they could never, ever send. They poured their anguish, their enduring love, and their fragile, flickering hopes onto paper. My dearest, one might read, the ink slightly smudged by a tired hand, the river looks the same today, but the water feels colder. I walked past our favorite bench in the park, but it was empty, and the leaves are falling so fast now. I close my eyes in the dark, and I try to hear you singing. These letters were folded carefully and hidden away, slipped under loose floorboards, tucked behind loose bricks in the fireplace, or pressed tightly into the spines of old, unread books. They were silent testaments to a life interrupted, a quiet, stubborn rebellion of memory against a regime that demanded total forgetfulness. The shadow was incredibly heavy, and the night felt endlessly long. The man of ice, sitting in his grand, stolen castle upon the hill, looked down at the darkened streets and believed he had frozen the city to its very core. He saw the empty squares, the bowed heads of the pedestrians, and the silence, and he believed, with absolute certainty, that he had won. But he did not understand the nature of the human heart. He did not know the profound warmth that can be generated when people huddle together in the dark. He did not know that a melody, once it has been learned by heart, can never truly be unlearned. The city of Prague was mourning, yes. It was weeping in the shadows, its tears falling silently on the ancient stones. But beneath the frost, beneath the tightly drawn curtains and the locked, heavy doors, the heart of the golden city continued to beat. It beat in the hushed, soothing lullabies sung to frightened children in the dead of night. It beat in the shared, knowing glances of strangers who recognized the exact same quiet sorrow in each other's eyes. The music had stopped playing in the open streets, But it had not died. It had simply taken refuge in the safest, most impenetrable place of all, the human soul. And there, in the warm, protected dark, it waited. It is a terrible burden to sleep in a quiet, safe bed when you know your homeland is shivering in the dark. Far away from the cobblestone streets of Prague, across a wide and restless sea, the city of London was wrapped in its own kind of twilight. The fog rolled thick off the River Thames, carrying the smell of damp wool, wet pavement, and the faint, bitter tang of coal smoke. Here, too, the windows were covered with heavy blackout curtains, keeping the city hidden from the bombers that sometimes crossed the night sky. But inside these brick houses and quiet offices, there was no man of polished glass waiting to knock at the door. There was safety. There was a fragile, guarded peace. And for the men who had been forced to leave their golden city behind, that safety was the heaviest weight of all. Imagine sitting in a high-backed leather chair, the warmth of a small fireplace resting gently against your shins. The room smells of polished oak and steeped English tea, a quiet, civilized refuge from the storms raging across the continent. In this room sit the exiled leaders of a broken nation. They are men with silver in their hair and deep, tired lines etched around their eyes. They wear neat suits and speak in hushed, measured voices, but beneath the quiet dignity of their posture, their hearts are stretched across 1,000 miles of hostile land, tethered to the homes they can no longer touch. To be an exile is to live as a ghost in two worlds. You walk the streets of a foreign capital, you buy the morning newspaper, you nod a polite greeting to the baker on the corner, but your mind is never truly there. Your mind is always walking down the avenues of your youth. You are always listening for the sound of your own language, hoping to catch a familiar melody on the wind. For these men, every cup of tea was a reminder of the cafes they had lost. Every chime of Big Ben was a reminder of the ancient astronomical clock that now ticked under the shadow of the occupier. They lived for the fragments of news that managed to slip through the cracks of the closing world. The messages did not come through official telegrams. They came in tiny, crumpled pieces of tissue paper, smuggled in the heels of shoes or hidden in the linings of old coats. They were written in invisible ink or spoken in hushed whispers by brave souls who had crossed the mountains in the dead of night. When a new message arrived, the room would fall into an absolute, breathless silence. An older man would unfold the fragile paper with trembling fingers, adjusting his reading glasses as he held it up to the dim light of a desk lamp. The words on those pages were never about grand military strategies. They were the quiet, agonizing cries of a suffocating people. They read that the universities had been closed. They read that the violin maker down the street had simply disappeared one Tuesday morning. They read about the slow, methodical erasing of their culture, the changing of the street signs, the silencing of the songs. They read about the man of ice, and how his grip was slowly freezing the spirit of the nation they loved so fiercely. And as they read these words, the men in the quiet London rooms would look into the fire, the flames reflecting in their tear-filled eyes. How do you comfort a weeping child when you are an ocean away? How do you tell your people to hold on to hope when you are sitting in a warm room and they are standing in the freezing rain? This was the agonizing guilt of the safe harbor. They felt every arrest as a personal failure. They felt every silenced voice as a reproach against their own survival. They knew that their people were beginning to wonder if the world had forgotten them. They knew that when you live in absolute darkness for long enough, you begin to doubt that the sun ever existed at all. As the months stretched into years, a terrifying realization began to settle over the men in the leather chairs. They realized that if the man of polished glass was allowed to continue his work undisturbed, the soul of their nation would not just be imprisoned, it would be extinguished entirely. A country is not just a collection of buildings and borders. A country is a shared dream. It is a shared memory. And if all the dreamers are silenced, the country dies, even if the ground remains. They needed to show their people that the dream was still alive. They needed to show the world, and perhaps even themselves, that their nation had not quietly surrendered to the winter. They needed to strike a spark in the absolute dark. But here lay the most impossible, heartbreaking choice a leader could ever face. They gathered around a heavy oak table, spreading out a map of their homeland. They traced the curving line of the Vltava River with their fingertips, touching the paper as gently as one might stroke the cheek of a sleeping child. They knew the geography not as coordinates, but as memories. Here's the bridge where my wife and I first walked. Here's the park where my children played. Here is the curve in the road. They knew that to strike at the man of ice, to reach out across the sea and attempt to shatter his perfect, cruel machinery, would bring a terrible storm down upon the innocent. The man of glass did not understand justice, he only understood vengeance. If they lit a lantern in the dark, the shadow would lash out blindly at whoever stood nearby. If they sent a spark, the resulting fire would undoubtedly consume the very people they were trying to save. How does a man weigh the soul of a nation against the blood of its citizens? How do you sign an order knowing that it will inevitably lead to the weeping of mothers and the empty chairs at dinner tables? For days, the men paced the floorboards of their London offices. They did not sleep. They sat in the dark, listening to the rain tap against the window panes, tormented by the faces of their friends back home. They argued in hushed, desperate voices. Some said the cost was too high, that they must simply wait for the Allied armies to end the war, preserving as many lives as possible. But others stared into the dying embers of the fireplace and saw a different truth. They saw that a life lived entirely on one's knees, entirely devoid of hope or identity, is a slow kind of death anyway. They believed that a nation must prove it is willing to bleed for its freedom, or else it may never truly be free again. They believed that to let the tyrant rule unchallenged was a betrayal of everything their ancestors had built. It was a decision made not with the fiery, blind passion of anger, but with the profound, devastating sorrow of a father who must cut off his own arm to save his child. Late one evening, when the fog outside was so thick it swallowed the street lamps entirely, the final decision was made. The room was perfectly still. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with a heavy, rhythmic heartbeat. A pen was dipped into an inkwell. The scratch of the metal nib against the paper sounded impossibly loud in the quiet room. They would light the lantern. They would send a spark back across the sea. They would strike at the very heart of the winter. When the paper was signed, no one cheered. No one offered a toast. The men simply sat back in their chairs, a profound exhaustion washing over them. They looked at each other with eyes that carried the weight of the world. They knew that history might judge them as heroes, or it might judge them as monsters for the retribution they were about to unleash. But in that quiet room, they were neither. They were just men, deeply in love with a home they could not protect, trying to do the only thing they had left to do. Now, they had to find the hands that would carry this spark. They could not send an army. They could not send a fleet of bombers. They needed quiet, brave men. They needed sons of the Golden City who were willing to walk back into the darkness, knowing they would almost certainly never return to the light. They sent word to the secret training camps scattered across the English countryside, looking for the threads that would weave this impossible destiny. They were looking for men who remembered the songs of the cobblestones. They were looking for men whose love for their home was stronger than their fear of the ice. As the exiled leaders looked out the window into the London night, their thoughts drifted across the channel, over the occupied lands, and settled softly on the rooftops of Prague. They whispered a silent apology into the glass. They whispered a prayer for the innocent. And they hoped, with a desperate, breaking heart, that when the lantern was finally lit, the light would somehow be worth the terrible cost of the flame. There are friendships born not in the light of day, but in the quiet, shared spaces of a long and heavy night. If you were to wander through the damp, green countryside of England during those suspended years, far from the ancient cobblestones and the ticking of the astronomical clock, you would find camps of young men waiting in the mist. They wore uniforms of heavy wool that never quite seemed to dry in the constant drizzle. They lived in a strange, agonizing limbo, their bodies safe on foreign soil, while their hearts remained trapped behind the drawn curtains of their homeland. It is a very specific kind of ache, to be young, to be full of life, and to feel completely helpless as the world you love is slowly swallowed by the dark. Among these waiting men were two gentle souls, two threads waiting to be drawn into the great and terrible loom of fate. Their names were Jan and Josef. They did not look like the towering heroes of ancient myths. If you passed them sitting on a wooden bench outside their barracks, you would simply see two young men, their faces still holding the soft edges of youth. You might see Jan carefully stitching a torn seam on his coat, his eyes focused and calm, his hands moving with the quiet patience of a man who grew up watching the slow turning of the seasons in the golden fields of Moravia. You might see Josef sitting beside him, whittling a small piece of pine with a pocket knife, a quiet strength in his shoulders, carrying the memory of the deep, silent forests of Slovakia in his steady gaze. They were from different corners of their broken country, but exile has a way of erasing boundaries and forging bonds that are deeper than blood. They became brothers not by birth, but by shared sorrow. Their friendship was not built on loud declarations or boisterous laughter. It was built on a profound, unspoken understanding. They were two young men who had learned the value of a shared silence. When the camp radio played a faint, crackling melody that sounded just a little bit like a folk song from home, they did not need to speak. They would simply exchange a brief, heavy look, and in that single glance, an entire universe of longing was understood. They knew the exact shape of each other's homesickness. They knew the names of the sisters left behind, the smell of their mother's kitchens, the specific curve of the river where they used to swim in the heat of late summer. To survive the guilt of the safe harbor, you need an anchor. For Jan, that anchor was Josef. For Josef, it was January. When the nightmares came, as they so often did in the deep, quiet hours of the night, and one of them woke with a sudden, sharp breath, the other would quietly strike a match. They would sit together on the edge of a narrow cot, the tiny, flickering flame casting long shadows on the wooden walls, sharing a single cigarette in the dark until the trembling finally stopped. The presence of the other was a silent promise, * you are not alone in this exile. I remember the sun just as you do, *. And so, they waited, carrying the immense weight of their youth in a world that seemed to have no place for them. But far away, in the quiet, oak-paneled rooms of London, the older men with the heavy hearts were looking for a spark to cast into the winter. They were looking for hands steady enough to carry a lantern back into the absolute dark. The summons did not come with a blaring trumpet or a shouted command. It came as a quiet whisper. A simple request to travel to the city, to enter a certain building, and to sit in a certain room. Imagine the two friends walking together through the unfamiliar streets of London, the fog thick and cool against their cheeks. They did not know exactly what awaited them, but the air felt heavy with a sudden, profound gravity. When they were ushered into the quiet office, the door clicked shut behind them with a sound of utter finality. The older men in the leather chairs looked at Jan and Josef. The air in the room was still, smelling of old paper and steeped tea. Dust motes danced lazily in a single shaft of pale light falling across the heavy desk. For a long moment, no one spoke. The exiled leaders simply looked at the two young men, seeing the smooth, unlined faces, seeing the bright, quiet life in their eyes. The leaders knew, with a crushing, devastating sorrow, what they were about to ask. They were about to ask these two beautiful, ordinary threads to weave themselves into a tapestry of absolute ruin. An older man, his voice soft and slightly unsteady, finally broke the silence. He did not speak of grand military strategies or political movements. He spoke of the shadow falling over their home. He spoke of the man of polished glass, and the cold that was freezing the very soul of their people. And then, he poured 2 cups of tea, slid them gently across the polished wood of the desk, and asked the impossible question. "We need someone to go back," he said, his voice barely a whisper. * We need someone to remind them that we have not forgotten. But the journey, it is a path into the deepest part of the winter. And it is very likely a path from which you will not return, *. There was no dramatic pause. There was no fiery speech of patriotism or vengeance from the young men. Jan and Josef did not look at the maps on the wall. They did not look at the older men behind the desk. They turned, very slowly, and looked at each other. In that single, quiet exchange of glances, an entire lifetime was communicated. They saw the golden fields and the deep forests. They saw the faces of their mothers, waiting by windows that would never again reflect their sons' faces. They saw the beautiful, ordinary lives they might have lived, the homes they might have built, the children they might have held, the quiet, peaceful old age they might have reached. All of it, a vast and shimmering ocean of possibilities, resting right there in the space between them. And they saw the shadow. They saw the absolute necessity of the spark. Josef gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. Jan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a gentle yielding to fate, and nodded in return. They turned back to the older men. "We will go," they said softly. Just 3 simple words, spoken with the calm, devastating peace of a falling leaf. When they walked out of that building and back into the London fog, the city looked exactly the same. The double-decker buses still rumbled down the avenues, the street vendors still called out their wares, and the world continued its indifferent rotation. But for Jan and Josef, the universe had entirely shifted. The agonizing limbo of waiting was over. The heavy, shapeless dread had finally coalesced into a sharp, undeniable point. They walked to a small, quiet park and sat on a damp iron bench beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree. The afternoon was fading into a bruised, purple twilight. For a long time, they just sat there, listening to the rustle of the leaves and the distant murmur of the city. The burden placed upon their young shoulders was unimaginably heavy. To know the time and place of your own ending is a terrifying ghost to carry. It changes the way you look at the world. Suddenly, the smallest things become unbearably beautiful and profoundly tragic. The rough texture of the wool against their hands, the smell of the damp earth, the warm, bitter taste of a shared cup of coffee, every sensation was magnified, precious, and slipping away. But as the evening deepened and the first pale stars pricked through the fog, a strange, quiet grace settled over them. The terror of the one-way journey was immense, yes, but it was softened by a deeply human comfort. Jan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the wet pavement. Josef placed a hand gently, firmly, on his friend's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, a grounding weight in a world that was suddenly spinning entirely out of control. They realized, in the quiet dark of that park, the most profound mercy of their tragic assignment. They were walking into the absolute shadow, they were walking toward the man of unfeeling ice, and they were walking toward an end they could not escape. But they were not walking alone. Whatever happened in the frozen streets of their homeland, whatever terror waited for them in the dark, they would face it together. Their threads had been permanently intertwined. They would share the cold, they would share the fear, and when the final moment came, they would share the quiet peace of having done all they could for the people they loved. They stood up from the bench, brushing the autumn leaves from their coats. They did not walk with the stiff, rigid march of soldiers. They walked with the slow, gentle grace of young men carrying a fragile, glowing ember in their hands, protecting it against the wind as they began the long, quiet walk toward the deepest part of the night. There is a profound and heavy magic in the last time you do a perfectly ordinary thing. Somewhere in the damp, rolling hills of the countryside, hidden away behind thick veils of morning mist and tall, ancient pines, the two friends spent their final weeks of safety. The estate they lived in was a quiet place, an old stone house that seemed to breathe with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a forgotten era. Outside the tall windows, the wind would sweep through the heather, carrying the smell of wet earth and impending winter. It was a beautiful, melancholic landscape, completely indifferent to the agonizing turning of the world, and completely unaware of the terrible burden resting on the shoulders of its temporary guests. During the pale, gray hours of the day, Jan and Josef were taught the harsh, unnatural choreography of survival. They learned how to move without making a sound, how to fall without breaking, how to hide in the shallowest of shadows. But the story of these days is not found in the mud of the training fields, nor is it found in the cold, heavy equipment they learned to carry. The true story, the one that lingers softly in the corners of that old house, is found in the quiet, fragile hours of the evening. When the sun finally dipped below the hills, painting the bruised sky in shades of violet and charcoal, the day's harshness would melt away. The young men would peel off their damp woolen coats, hang them near the hearth to dry, and step into the warm, amber glow of the sitting room. In the face of an inescapable destiny, the human heart does a remarkable thing. It stops looking toward the distant horizon, and instead, it zooms in on the beautiful, microscopic details of the present moment. Time, which used to be a vast and endless river, suddenly becomes a small, precious cup of water, and you learn to savor every single drop. Imagine the deep, abiding comfort of a simple cup of tea. In a world that is spinning entirely out of control, the act of wrapping your cold, tired hands around a warm ceramic mug becomes an anchor. Jan would sit in a worn velvet armchair, bringing the rim of the cup to his lips, closing his eyes as the steam rose against his cheeks. He would feel the heat seep through his skin, a gentle, spreading warmth that chased the damp chill from his bones. Across the room, Josef would be coaxing a fire back to life, the orange flames catching the edges of the dry wood with a soft, crackling pop. In these suspended evenings, they found a fleeting, desperate normalcy. They did not speak of the man of polished glass. They did not speak of the ice that awaited them, or the perilous journey through the dark sky. Instead, they spoke of the beautifully mundane. Josef would make a quiet, wry joke about the terrible, never-ending rain, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Jan would laugh, a soft, genuine sound that floated up toward the high ceiling. If you had stood in the hallway and listened to that laugh, you would have wept. It was a defiant, beautiful sound. It was the sound of a young man insisting on his own humanity, insisting on joy, even while standing at the very edge of the abyss. They found comfort in the familiar cadence of their own language, rolling the syllables around in the quiet room, keeping the memory of their golden city alive in the air between them. They shared memories of clumsy childhood mistakes, of stolen kisses by the riverbank, of the exact, sweet taste of a pastry from a bakery that was now 1,000 miles away. For a few hours each night, the war did not exist. There was only the fire, the tea, and the unbreakable bond between two gentle souls. But eventually, the fire would burn down to a soft, glowing bed of embers. The clock on the mantel would tick with a heavy, rhythmic heartbeat, each second pulling them closer to the dawn. And it was in these deepest, quietest hours of the night that the final, most agonizing task had to be done. A quiet officer would enter the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick rug. He would carry a small stack of plain, unlined paper, a few envelopes, and a dark glass bottle of ink. He would set these items gently on the heavy oak table, give the young men a soft, sorrowful nod, and leave them alone. It was time to write the final letters home. How do you distill the entirety of your love into a single piece of paper? How do you say goodbye to a mother, to a father, to a sweetheart, when you cannot tell them where you are going, what you are doing, or that you will never, ever see them again? Jan sat down at the table, the wooden chair creaking softly beneath him. He picked up a fountain pen, feeling the cool metal against his fingers. He stared at the blank, white page. The paper seemed impossibly vast, a silent void waiting to swallow his final thoughts. For a long time, he just sat there, listening to the rain gently tapping against the window pane. He closed his eyes, and he was no longer in a damp stone house in exile. He was back in his mother's kitchen. He could smell the sharp, clean scent of the soap she used to wash the floors. He could feel her warm hand brushing the hair back from his forehead. He swallowed hard against the tight, aching lump in his throat. He touched the pen to the paper. The metal nib scratched softly, a rhythmic, hushed sound in the quiet room. He wrote about the weather, pretending he was simply away on a long, ordinary journey. He asked about the health of the family dog. He told his mother to make sure she wore her heavy scarf when the winter wind blew through the valley. He wove his profound, earth-shattering love into the spaces between simple, everyday words. He was trying to build a bridge of ink across the ocean, a bridge that would carry his warmth to her long after his hands had gone cold. "I am safe," he wrote, though he was walking toward the fire. "I am happy," he wrote, though his heart was breaking with the weight of the farewell. "Think of me when the first leaves of spring appear." Across the table, Joseph was writing his own silent goodbye. His handwriting was careful and deliberate. He was thinking of a girl with bright eyes and a quick smile, a girl he had danced with under a canopy of stars and a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. He wanted to tell her that he carried her face in his mind like a protective talisman. He wanted to apologize for the pain his absence would bring. But the rules of the shadow world were strict. He could not write of love in a way that would put her in danger. He could only write in riddles of affection, hoping that her heart would understand the true meaning hidden beneath the ink. Sometimes, the weight of it all would become too much. Joseph's hand would stop moving. He would stare at the drying ink, his vision blurring as a single, heavy tear threatened to fall. But he would blink it away, take a slow, trembling breath, and continue to write. There was a quiet, agonizing dignity in their restraint. They were sparing their loved ones the terror of the truth, carrying the entire burden of the goodbye squarely on their own young shoulders. When the letters were finally finished, they folded the papers with slow, deliberate care. They slipped them into the envelopes, sealing them shut. Those small paper rectangles were no longer just letters, they were ghosts. They were fragments of their own souls, left behind to haunt the physical world after they were gone. They handed the envelopes to the keeper of the letters, a man who took them with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. These letters would be locked away in a dark drawer, waiting in silence. They would only be mailed if the unthinkable happened. To hand over the letter was to acknowledge the end. It was the final tether to the safe, ordinary world, slowly slipping from their grasp. On their last night in the old stone house, there was no grand feast, no loud speeches, no dramatic farewells. They walked upstairs to their small bedroom, the floorboards creaking familiar, comforting complaints beneath their feet. They packed their small, canvas bags. They packed very little. A spare pair of wool socks. A shaving razor. A small, worn photograph tucked carefully into a breast pocket, resting right over the heart. They were stripping down their existence to the absolute essentials. The beautiful, complicated tapestry of their youth was being unraveled, leaving only two single, strong threads. Jan sat on the edge of his narrow cot, running his hands over the rough wool blanket. Joseph stood by the window, looking out into the pitch-black night, where the fog had swallowed the trees and the hills and the stars. "It is a very dark night," Joseph whispered, his breath briefly fogging the cold glass. Jan looked up, his face calm and smooth in the dim light. "Yes," he replied softly. "But the sun will come up. It always does. Even if we are not here to see it." They did not speak again. They lay down in the dark, listening to the steady, reassuring breathing of the other. The terrible anxiety of the waiting was gone, replaced by a strange, sweeping peace. The choices had been made. The letters had been written. The tears had been quietly shed, and the tea had been drunk. Tomorrow, they would put on heavy boots. They would step into the belly of a roaring machine. They would fall through the freezing air and land in a world ruled by a man of polished glass. But tonight, they were just two boys from the country, resting in the quiet dark, holding tightly to the memory of the light, and waiting for the morning to come. There is a moment between the edge of the sky and the solid earth where you belong entirely to the wind. If you close your eyes and listen to the deep, rhythmic hum of the night, you can almost feel the vibration of the metal floorboards beneath heavy leather boots. High above the sleeping world, hidden within a thick blanket of winter clouds, a solitary aircraft was making its way across the dark. Inside the belly of this great, roaring machine, there was no warm hearth, no gentle lamplight, and no soft velvet armchair. There was only the cold, unyielding curve of the fuselage, the scent of engine oil, and the dim, haunting glow of a single red bulb. In this narrow, trembling space sat Jan and Josef. They were wrapped in thick layers of wool and heavy canvas, their parachute harnesses pulled tight across their chests, holding them in a firm, protective embrace. The noise of the engines was a constant, deafening waterfall of sound, so loud that it simply became a new kind of silence. They could not speak to one another. Words would have been instantly swallowed by the roar of the propellers. But after everything they had shared, the quiet cups of tea, the letters written by the fire, the long walks in the fog, they no longer needed to speak. They sat shoulder to shoulder, feeling the familiar, reassuring warmth of the other just beneath the thick layers of their coats. They were suspended in a strange, agonizing limbo. They had left the safe harbor of their exile far behind, but they had not yet arrived in the terrible reality of their destination. For these few, fragile hours, they belonged nowhere. They were simply two wandering souls, carried through the icy heavens, tracing a path back to a home that had been stolen from them in the dark. Jan rested his head against the cold metal wall, his eyes half closed. The vibration of the plane seeped into his bones, a constant reminder of the incredible speed at which they were rushing toward their fate. He thought of the quiet stone house they had left behind. He wondered if the ashes in the fireplace were still warm. He wondered if the letters they had written were already locked away in the dark drawer, waiting patiently in the silence. It felt like a lifetime had passed since he had held that warm cup of tea, yet the taste of it still lingered faintly on his tongue. Across the narrow aisle, Josef stared at the floor, his face bathed in the eerie red light. His hands, clad in thick, heavy gloves, rested quietly on his knees. He was trying to picture the forests of his youth, trying to conjure the smell of the pine needles and the sound of the wind moving through the high branches. He was trying to build a bridge in his mind between the beautiful memories of his childhood and the frozen, hostile reality that waited for them below. Suddenly, the pitch of the engines changed, dropping into a lower, heavier register. The plane banked gently, leaning into the wind. The moment had arrived. The heavy metal hatch in the floor of the aircraft was pulled open, and the world outside rushed in. It was a breath of absolute, breathtaking winter. The freezing air swirled into the dim cabin, bringing with it the scent of ice and distant snow. It was a smell they knew intimately. It was the smell of their homeland in the deep, dormant months of the year. But it was no longer the welcoming chill of a familiar winter evening. It was the biting, hostile breath of a country held captive. The dispatcher, a man whose face was hidden in the shadows, gave a slow, solemn nod. He did not shout. He simply pointed downward, into the swirling black void. Jan moved first. He shuffled forward to the edge of the opening, his boots heavy on the metal floor. He looked down, but there was nothing to see. The earth below was completely swallowed by the night. It was like looking into a deep, bottomless well. He did not hesitate. He did not close his eyes. He simply stepped forward, off the edge of the world, and allowed the night to take him. Josef followed a breath later, stepping into the slipstream, leaving the trembling metal bird behind. The initial fall was a rush of pure, deafening wind. The air tore at their clothes, stealing the warmth from their bodies in an instant. They were tumbling through the absolute dark, untethered, falling like stones through the freezing sky. It is a terrifying, beautiful surrender, to give yourself over entirely to gravity, trusting in a few folded yards of thin silk to save you from the earth. And then, with a sharp, sudden jolt that pulled tight against their shoulders, the parachutes blossomed open. Instantly, the violent rushing of the wind stopped. The roar of the airplane engines faded into a distant, melancholy hum, moving away toward the horizon, until it was nothing more than a memory. They were caught by the invisible hands of the air, slowing their descent, suspending them between the stars and the snow. If you have ever stood alone in a field during a heavy snowfall, you know the profound, beautiful silence that settles over the world. The snow absorbs the sound, softening the edges of reality, wrapping the earth in a thick, peaceful slumber. As Jan and Josef drifted downward, hanging beneath their dark canopies, they became a part of that silent snowfall. They were two solitary flakes, drifting through the frozen velvet of the night. It was the most peaceful they had felt in months. Hanging there in the vast, empty sky, there were no commanders, no typed orders, no drawn curtains, and no men of polished glass. There was only the gentle sway of the harness, the quiet creak of the nylon cords, and the breathtaking, lonely beauty of the winter night. Below them, the landscape slowly began to reveal itself through the darkness. The clouds parted just enough to let a pale, silver wash of moonlight spill across the earth. They could see the rolling hills, the dark, jagged lines of the forests, and the winding, frozen ribbons of the rivers. The fields were covered in an unbroken blanket of pristine white. It was their home. It was the soil that had nurtured them, the land that held the bones of their ancestors and the memories of their youth. Looking down at it from the silent heavens, it looked so unimaginably peaceful. It looked like a sleeping child tucked beneath a heavy quilt. But they knew the terrifying truth. They knew that beneath that beautiful, quiet snow, the shadow was moving. They knew that the ancient cities were holding their breath, and that the warmth of the people had been forced into hiding. They were falling back into a world that loved them, but a world that could no longer protect them. They were returning as ghosts, invisible men meant to walk unnoticed through a landscape of fear. The cold was profound. It seeped through their thick wool coats, biting at their cheeks and numbing their fingers. It was not just the physical cold of the winter air, it was the chilling realization of their absolute isolation. Once their boots touched the snow, there would be no safe house waiting. There would be no warm fire, no friendly face, no cup of tea. They were entirely alone, dropping into a vast, silent ocean of hostility. The ground rushed up to meet them, a dark, fast-moving blur of trees and shadows. The landing was not gentle. The earth was frozen hard, unyielding, and cruel. Jan hit the ground and rolled into the deep snow, the breath knocked from his lungs in a sudden, sharp gasp. The parachute canopy collapsed around him, a massive, billowing shroud of dark silk settling over the white field. A moment later, he heard the soft, muffled thud of Josef landing somewhere in the trees nearby. They lay still for a long moment, their chests heaving, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. The shock of the impact, the sudden return to the heavy, pulling weight of the earth, was overwhelming. They pressed their faces into the cold snow, feeling the sharp, stinging bite of the ice against their skin. They were breathing the air of their homeland again. It tasted of pine needles and frost, sharp and clean and impossibly sad. Slowly, carefully, Jan pushed himself up onto his knees. The silence of the forest was absolute. There were no sirens. There were no shouting voices. There was only the wind moving softly through the bare branches of the trees, a lonely, whispering lullaby. He unclipped the heavy metal buckles of his harness, his numb fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar clasps. He had to gather the parachute. In this frozen, watchful world, the silk was a beacon, a massive, undeniable sign that the sky had dropped a secret into the snow. He pulled the fabric toward him, wrestling with the cold, stiff material, burying it deep in a snowdrift beneath the low branches of an evergreen tree. Josef emerged from the shadows of the tree line, a dark silhouette against the pale snow. He moved without a sound, his boots sinking deep into the drifts. When he reached Jan, he did not speak. He simply reached out and placed a heavy, gloved hand on his friend's shoulder. They stood together in the freezing dark, surrounded by the towering pines. The isolation was immense, a physical weight pressing down on them from the starless sky. They were two small, fragile threads, dropped entirely alone into the darkest, coldest corner of the loam. The world they had landed in was entirely against them. Every road, every bridge, every shadow belonged to the man of polished glass. They looked out into the thick woods, where the snow was falling softly, covering their tracks, erasing the evidence of their arrival from the sky. They pulled their heavy collars up against the biting wind. They had no map for the darkness they were about to enter. They had only the quiet, unspoken promise they had made to each other, and the enduring, unbreakable memory of the light. With a slow, deep breath of the freezing air, they turned their backs to the buried silk, and took their first, silent steps into the deep and unforgiving winter. There is a profound, almost gentle persuasion in the freezing cold, whispering for you to simply close your eyes and rest. As Jan and Josef moved deeper into the winter forest, the cold ceased to be merely a temperature, it became a living, breathing companion. It walked beside them, tugging at the heavy wool of their coats, slipping icy fingers past their collars, settling deep into the marrow of their bones. The snow beneath their boots was thick and unyielding, transforming every step into a monumental effort. The trees towered above them like silent sentinels, their bare branches etched like charcoal strokes against the bruised violet of the night sky. In this frozen isolation, the mind begins to play tricks. The howling of the wind sounds like a human voice. The shifting of a snow-laden branch looks like the sudden movement of a patrol. But the deepest danger was not the shadows in the woods, it was the seductive, heavy pull of exhaustion. When the cold truly takes hold of a body, it does not bring immediate panic. It brings a terrible, beautiful lethargy. It promises that if you just sit down beneath the shelter of a pine tree for a single moment, the shivering will finally stop. Jan felt this heavy blanket of sleep pressing against his shoulders. He stumbled, his knee hitting the frozen earth, the snow swallowing the sound of his fall. But before the darkness could pull him under, he felt a thick leather glove close firmly around his arm. It was Josef. There were no words exchanged in the howling wind, only the steady, pulling weight of a brother refusing to let go. They hauled each other upright, leaning shoulder to shoulder, becoming a single, fragile entity moving against the overwhelming tide of the winter. And then, through the dense, skeletal fingers of the trees, a miracle appeared. It was not a grand beacon or a blazing bonfire. It was merely a speck, a tiny, flickering pinprick of amber light. To a man who is freezing in the absolute dark, a single lit window is more magnificent than the brightest star in the heavens. It means fire. It means walls. It means life. But in a country held captive by the shadow, a lit window is also a terrifying question. Who sits beside that lantern? Is it a friend who remembers the old songs, or is it someone whose fear has turned them into an informer? The man of polished glass had built his empire on this very mistrust, turning neighbors into strangers, making the simple act of asking for help a gamble with death. Jan and Josef stood in the tree line, watching the square of golden light. The wind bit fiercely at their raw cheeks. They knew they could not survive another hour in the open snow. The choice was made not by strategy, but by the absolute necessity of the freezing blood in their veins. They approached the solitary farmhouse with agonizing slowness. Every crunch of the snow beneath their boots felt to them as loud as a gunshot in the silent valley. The house was modest, built of rough-hewn timber and fieldstone, a humble dwelling tucked away from the main roads, sleeping quietly beneath a heavy roof of white. They reached the thick wooden door. Jan raised his hand, his knuckles numb and stiff, and tapped 3 times against the timber. The sound was small, muffled by the falling snow, but it echoed like thunder in their own chests. They waited. The silence that followed was agonizing. Then, from within the belly of the house, came the soft, shuffling sound of footsteps. The scraping of a heavy iron latch. The door creaked open, just a fraction at first, spilling a narrow ribbon of warm, golden light out onto the blue-tinted snow. In the doorway stood an older man. He held a simple kerosene lantern, lifting it so the light fell upon the 2 figures standing in the storm. His face was lined with the deep, withered map of a life spent working the land. He looked at their heavy coats, entirely unfamiliar to the local villages. He looked at the frost clinging to their eyelashes, the exhaustion carved deep into their youthful faces. He did not ask for their papers. He did not ask for their names or where they had come from. In a world governed by cruel, unyielding rules, this old man looked at two strangers shivering in the dark, and he understood everything that mattered. He saw two sons of his homeland, hunted by the winter and hunted by the shadow. The penalty for harboring enemies of the occupation was absolute and brutal. To open a door was to invite the wrath of the man of ice directly into your own living room. The old man knew this. His heart must have hammered against his ribs like a frightened bird. But the true, quiet heroism of the everyday does not announce itself with grand speeches or waving flags. It happens in the space of a heartbeat. The old man slowly lowered the lantern, stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, and opened the door wider. It was a silent, monumental invitation. Stepping across that threshold was like stepping from a nightmare into a gentle, waking dream. The door closed firmly behind them, shutting out the howling wind and the blinding white of the storm. The air inside the cabin was thick and intoxicatingly warm. It smelled of wood smoke, baked apples, and the rich, earthy scent of drying herbs hung from the low wooden rafters. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting dancing, orange shadows across the whitewashed walls. The two young men stood frozen by the door, afraid to move, afraid to break the fragile spell of this sanctuary. From the corner of the room, an older woman appeared. She had a thick woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders and a face that radiated a quiet, anxious kindness. She did not speak, but she immediately went to a heavy iron pot resting on the edge of the hearth. She ladled out 2 bowls of warm, fragrant broth and set them on a scarred wooden table. She pointed to 2 chairs pulled close to the fire. Jan and Josef moved toward the warmth like men in a trance. When they took off their heavy leather gloves, their hands were shaking so violently they could barely hold the wooden spoons. Sit for a moment by this fire with them. Listen to the pop and hiss of the burning pine. Watch the way the color slowly begins to return to their pale cheeks. In the grand, sweeping histories of empires and wars, these moments are rarely recorded. The man of polished glass, with his meticulous files and towering architecture of fear, believed that power existed only in the grip of a weapon or the stamp of a document. He could not comprehend the immense, quiet power of a bowl of hot soup offered in the dead of night. He did not understand that true resistance is often born in the simple, defiant act of sharing one's bread. The old couple sat in the shadows of the room, watching the 2 young men eat. They knew the danger resting at their table, yet there was a soft, glowing pride in the woman's eyes. By warming these strangers, by feeding these exhausted boys, they were fighting back in the only way they could. They were keeping the ember of their nation alive. They were proving that the cold had not conquered their hearts. After they ate, Jan and Josef were given a pile of thick, heavy quilts on the floor near the hearth. Lying down in the soft, dry wool, feeling the radiant heat of the stones against their aching backs, they experienced a profound, sweeping wave of gratitude. The terror of the parachute drop, the freezing isolation of the forest, the impossible weight of their mission, all of it briefly dissolved in the gentle glow of the firelight. Josef looked across the dim room at the old man, who had fallen asleep in a wooden rocking chair, keeping a silent, protective watch over the door. A profound love for his people welled up in Josef's chest, a love so fierce and tender it brought tears to his closed eyes. This was why they had returned. Not for politics, not for distant governments, but for the quiet, beautiful souls of the people who still knew how to open a door in the dark. But safety, in those times, was a deeply fragile thing. It was a temporary blanket that could be ripped away at any moment. Jan and Josef knew they could not stay. To linger when the sun rose would be to condemn this gentle, heroic couple to the terrible vengeance of the shadow. They had to leave before the village awoke, before the morning patrols began to trace the fresh footprints in the snow. Long before the first pale hints of dawn began to bruise the eastern horizon, the 2 young men quietly rose from their quilts. The fire had burned down to a soft, pulsing bed of red embers. The cabin was profoundly still. They laced up their heavy boots, their fingers now warm and steady. They pulled on their heavy coats, preparing to step back into the jaws of the winter. As they stood by the door, the old woman emerged from the shadows. She held out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, a loaf of dark bread, and a small wedge of hard cheese. She pressed it into Jan's hands. Her hands were warm and dry, the hands of a mother sending her children out into the world. Jan looked down at her, his heart entirely too full for words. He gently squeezed her hand, a silent transmission of thanks, of sorrow, of profound respect. Joseph gave the old man a deep, solemn nod. Then, they lifted the heavy iron latch, and pulled the door open. The wind was still blowing, the snow still falling softly through the dark trees. But as they stepped out into the freezing night, leaving the golden light of the hearth behind them, they realized that the cold could no longer reach the deepest parts of their souls. They carried the warmth of that small cabin within them, a burning ember of human kindness tucked safely in their chests. It was a warmth that would sustain them through the long miles ahead, a quiet, luminous reminder that even in the absolute heart of the winter, the beautiful, stubborn light of humanity refuses to be extinguished. The strongest walls in the world are not made of stone or steel, but of ordinary people holding their breath in the dark. To survive in a city that has been turned into a cage, you cannot remain a ghost forever. You cannot live indefinitely on the freezing forest floor, and you cannot walk forever in the shadows without eventually needing a place to rest. When Jan and Joseph finally slipped through the invisible perimeter and stepped onto the ancient cobblestones of the Golden City, they were entirely reliant on a fragile, hidden miracle. They needed a bridge. But this was not a bridge built of iron arches or thick stone pillars spanning the dark waters of the river. This was an invisible bridge, constructed entirely of whispers, shared glances, and unlocked doors. It was a network woven together by the most terrifying, beautiful courage imaginable. It was made of mothers, fathers, and children who looked at the overwhelming, suffocating power of the man of polished glass, and decided, in the quiet sanctuary of their own homes, to quietly defy him. Let us step into a small, dimly lit kitchen in the heart of the city, long after the evening curfew has fallen. The windows are covered tight with heavy blackout curtains, ensuring not a single sliver of light escapes into the freezing street below. At the wooden table stands a mother. She wears a faded floral apron over a mended woolen dress, her hands rough and tired from the endless, exhausting work of keeping a family alive during an occupation. On the table before her is a single, small loaf of dark bread and a pot of thin, watery cabbage soup. In times of peace, a mother's worry is a gentle thing. She worries if her children are warm enough, if they are learning their letters, if they are happy. But in the shadow of the winter, her worries have become razor-sharp. The food she has been allotted is barely enough to keep the hunger from waking her own children in the night. Yet, she takes a long, serrated knife and carefully, deliberately, cuts 2 extra, thick slices from the center of the loaf. She places the bread on a chipped porcelain plate. She ladles a measure of the warm, pale broth into 2 small ceramic bowls. She does not sigh. She does not complain. With a quiet, steady grace, she walks down the narrow hallway of her apartment. She stops before a closed door, perhaps a spare bedroom, perhaps a small study that has been hastily rearranged. She knocks twice, a sound so soft it is barely louder than the beating of her own heart. The door opens a fraction of an inch, and hands reach out from the shadows to take the meager offering. Think of the profound, earth-shattering heroism of this simple act. To give away your own family's food to strangers is a sacrifice of immense proportions. But to do so knowing that simply housing these men carries a penalty of absolute ruin, that is a love so fierce and deep it defies all logic. She returns to her kitchen, sits at the wooden table, and folds her hands in her lap, listening to the quiet murmur of voices behind the wall. She is wrapping these boys in the only armor she has, a mother's quiet, desperate care. In the small parlor of the same apartment, a father sits in a worn armchair. By day, he is a clerk, or perhaps a teacher. He rides the crowded morning tram with his head bowed, his briefcase resting on his knees, blending perfectly into the gray, exhausted masses of the captive city. He shows his papers to the patrols with a polite, vacant expression. He is the very picture of compliance. But beneath his heavy winter coat, his chest holds a secret so vast it threatens to crush his ribs. He is a guardian of the invisible bridge. When he returns home in the evening, he does not truly rest. He sits in his chair near the door, a cold pipe clamped between his teeth, and he listens. His ears are attuned to the symphony of the apartment building like a musician listening for a false note. He knows the heavy, shuffling steps of the elderly woman on the second floor. He knows the quick, light patter of the baker's son returning from his shift. He knows the exact groan of the floorboards on the landing. He is listening for the sound that haunts the nightmares of every soul in the city, the sharp, rhythmic crack of heavy leather boots on the stairs. Imagine the psychological toll of this constant, unending vigilance. Every time a door slams down the street, his breath catches in his throat. Every time a shadow passes across the gap in the curtains, his hand instinctively tightens on the armrest of his chair. He must maintain a face of perfect, mundane calm for his children, masking his terror with a gentle smile and a quiet story before bedtime. He knows that he has placed his entire world on a fragile pane of glass, and at any moment, the shadow could step forward and shatter it into a million irrecoverable pieces. Yet, he sits there, evening after evening, choosing to bear the agonizing weight of the watch, because he believes that freedom is worth the terror of the dark. And then, there are the children. Children are profoundly observant creatures. They notice the sudden hushed tones when they enter a room. They notice the extra bowls washed in the sink, the door that is suddenly kept locked, the faint smell of unfamiliar tobacco drifting through the hallway. The parents cannot tell them the truth, for a child's innocent word spoken in the street could bring the world crashing down upon them. So, they invent games of silence. We have gentle shadows living with us, a mother might whisper to her daughter, tucking her into bed. They are very tired from a long journey, and we must be as quiet as little mice so they can sleep. The children, sensing the profound gravity in their parents' eyes, understand the unspoken rule. They learn to play with their wooden blocks on the soft rugs, placing them down without a sound. They learn to swallow their laughter, letting it escape only as silent, breathless giggles into their pillows. Sometimes, the hidden men and the children share a quiet, wordless exchange. A little boy might push a small, carved wooden horse under the gap of the closed door. A moment later, the horse is gently pushed back, carrying a tiny piece of hard candy balanced on its back. For Jan and Josef, sitting in the agonizing confinement of a dim room, listening to the distant sounds of family life through the thin plaster walls, these small, brave gestures from the children are a lifeline. It reminds them of the pure, innocent world they are fighting to protect. It reminds them that despite the cold machinery of the occupation, the tender, playful heart of their people remains entirely unbroken. The man of polished glass, residing in his sprawling castle upon the hill, looked down at the sprawling city of Prague and saw only geometry. He saw supply lines, labor quotas, and a populace he believed he had neatly filed away into drawers of fear. He sent his patrols through the streets, looking for weapons, looking for secret transmitters, looking for grand, loud conspiracies. He was entirely blind to the invisible bridge. He could not comprehend it, because a mind devoid of empathy cannot perceive the architecture of love. He did not realize that the most dangerous weapon in his captive city was not made of metal or gunpowder. It was the quiet, stubborn resilience of a family gathered around a dinner table, choosing to share their bread with the hunted. There were rare, precious evenings when the danger felt slightly less suffocating. When the night was deep and the patrols had passed, the locked door would open. Jan and Josef would step out into the dim parlor, blinking in the soft amber light of a solitary lamp. The heavy curtains would be drawn tight, the radio turned to a bare, crackling whisper, playing a faint melody that smelled of the old days. In these fleeting moments, the apartment ceased to be a hiding place and simply became a home. The mother would pour tiny cups of weak, steeped tea. The father would offer a pinch of precious tobacco. They would sit together in a close, tight circle, speaking in hushed voices that barely disturbed the dust motes in the air. They did not speak of the mission. They did not speak of the danger or the terrifying odds. To speak of the abyss was to invite it into the room. Instead, they spoke of the spring. They spoke of the way the cherry trees used to bloom along the riverbanks, casting a soft, pink snow across the cobblestones. They spoke of the old cafes, the music, the books they missed reading. They built a temporary, shimmering illusion of peace within the four walls of the parlor. For the young men, these moments were a profound, agonizing comfort. They looked at the weary, kind faces of the parents, the sleeping children in the next room, and they felt a tidal wave of guilt and overwhelming gratitude. These ordinary people, who had never asked to be soldiers, had turned their homes into the front lines. They had offered their very lives as a shield. When the hour grew late, and it was time for the men to retreat back behind the hidden door, the farewells were always silent. A firm, lingering handshake from the father. A gentle, reassuring touch on the arm from the mother. No words were needed. The unspoken promise hung heavy and warm in the air, *, we will keep you safe tonight. We will hold the bridge until the morning, *. As the long winter dragged on, giving way to the agonizingly slow melt of the spring, the invisible bridge stretched across the city. The men were moved from apartment to apartment, slipping through the shadows, passed from one brave set of hands to another. Each family they stayed with became a vital pillar, holding them above the rushing, deadly waters of the occupation. History rarely records the names of those who simply opened a door. There are no statues in the grand squares for the mothers who watered down their soup, or the fathers who sat trembling in the dark, or the children who learned to play without making a sound. Their heroism was intimate, invisible, and profoundly quiet. But without them, there would be no story. Without the warm hearths hidden behind the heavy curtains, without the fragile, unbreakable bridge of human kindness, the spark would have died in the freezing snow. They were the silent breath that kept the ember glowing, holding back the long, cold night with nothing more than the stubborn, beautiful courage of an ordinary home. There is a particular kind of heartbreak in watching the world gently wake up, when you know your own long winter is about to fall. When the snow finally begins to surrender in the Golden City, it does not leave all at once. It retreats slowly, melting into the ancient grooves of the cobblestones, turning the steep roofs into dark, glistening mirrors under the pale morning sun. The thick ice on the river groans and shifts, cracking with a sound like a heavy, sleeping giant stretching its limbs. The water, trapped for so long in the dark, begins to flow freely again, rushing beneath the stone arches of the old bridges, carrying the last fragile fragments of winter away toward the sea. To the ordinary citizens of Prague, the arrival of spring was a desperately needed mercy. After months of freezing winds and a suffocating, icy occupation, the softening of the air felt like a quiet permission to breathe. People stepped out of their heavy woolen coats. They opened their windows just a fraction, allowing the sweet, damp smell of wet earth and new rain to drift into their dim parlors. The trees lining the grand avenues, which had stood like barren skeletons against the gray sky, slowly pushed forth their tiny, brilliant green buds. But for Jan and Josef, hidden away behind locked doors and drawn curtains, the blooming of the city was a beautiful, agonizing torture. When you are carrying a deadly, inescapable secret, time ceases to move in a straight line. It pulls around you. It stretches and thins until a single afternoon feels like an entire lifetime. The adrenaline of their falling through the night sky had long since faded, replaced by the heavy, crushing weight of the weight. Waiting is perhaps the greatest test of the human spirit. It is in the quiet, empty hours that the mind begins to wander, slipping through the cracks of your resolve, whispering your deepest fears directly into your ear. Imagine sitting in a cramped, shadowy room on the third floor of a silent apartment. The floorboards are covered with a faded rug, and the wallpaper peels slightly at the corners. Through a narrow, deliberate gap in the heavy curtains, a single shaft of spring sunlight falls across the room, illuminating a dancing galaxy of dust motes. Jan sits in a wooden chair, watching that beam of light. He holds his hand out, letting the warmth spill across his knuckles. It is a terrifyingly beautiful sensation. He moves his face closer to the glass, careful to stay hidden in the shadow, and looks down at the street below. He sees a young woman in a light-colored dress, carrying a basket of fresh, pale radishes. He watches a baker sweep the dust from his doorstep, pausing to wipe his brow in the warming air. He sees a small boy, his knees scuffed, chasing a stray dog around a lamppost, his silent, breathless laughter evident in the wide shape of his mouth. It is the magnificent, ordinary flow of human life, continuing exactly as it always has. But Jan and Josef have been excised from that flow. They are ghosts haunting a world they still possess the breath to touch, but are forbidden to join. The profound cruelty of the spring is that it demands you look toward the future. It is a season of beginnings, of planting seeds and making promises. But the two young men in the shadowed room have no future to plan. They cannot look at a blooming cherry tree and think of the fruit it will bear in the late summer. They can only look at the delicate pink petals and wonder if they will still be breathing when the blossoms finally fall to the earth. Josef lies on a narrow cot in the corner, staring up at the ceiling. The air in the room is growing warm, thick with the smell of old paper and quiet anxiety. He closes his eyes and listens to the sounds drifting up from the open windows of the city. He hears the distant, rhythmic clatter of a tram. He hears the faint chime of a bicycle bell. Every sound is a tether pulling at his heart, a desperate reminder of the world he loves so fiercely. He remembers the deep forests of his youth during the thaw. He remembers how the moss would turn a vibrant, startling emerald green, and how the air would smell of crushed pine needles and cold, rushing streams. He feels a sudden, overwhelming urge to simply stand up, turn the brass handle of the door, walk down the stairs, and step out into the sunlight. He wants to turn his face to the sky and feel the warm breeze against his cheeks. The desire to simply live, to be a young man in the springtime without the weight of a nation resting on his shoulders, is a physical ache in his chest. But then, the quiet hum of the street is shattered by the deep, mechanical growl of a heavy engine. Jan pulls back slightly from the curtain. A sleek, black car rolls slowly down the avenue, its polished metal reflecting the bright spring sun. Inside, behind the tinted glass, are the men of the occupation. The men of polished glass. The sight of them is a jarring, violent reminder that the spring is an illusion. The city may be wearing a crown of green leaves, but its hands are still bound in heavy iron. The tyrant still breathes, his cold gaze still freezing the hearts of the people, untouched by the warming of the earth. Jan turns from the window and looks at Josef. The shared silence between them is deep and absolute. They do not need to speak of the black car. They do not need to speak of the mission. The sudden surge of longing for the outside world recedes, replaced once again by the solemn, unbreakable vow they took in the damp English countryside. They love the spring, yes. But they love the people of this city more. And to save the garden, the serpent must be removed, even if the gardeners must fall in the process. It was during these agonizingly slow weeks that the families of the invisible bridge showed their most tender, heartbreaking courage. They knew the emotional toll the waiting was taking on their hidden guests. They saw the dark circles deepening under the young men's eyes. They saw the way their hands sometimes trembled when they reached for a cup of tea. One evening, just as the sky was turning a soft, bruised purple, the mother of the house softly unlocked the parlor door. She stepped into the dim room, her face tired but carrying a gentle, luminous smile. She kept her hands cupped together behind her back, like a child hiding a secret treasure. She walked over to the small, scratched wooden table where Jan and Josef sat, and she brought her hands forward. Resting in her palms was a single, small sprig of white lilac. She had found it growing bravely near an iron gate on her walk home from the market. She had shielded it beneath her coat, risking the suspicion of the patrols, simply to bring a fragment of the waking world to the men in the dark. She placed the fragile flower in a tiny glass of water in the center of the table. Instantly, the overwhelming, intoxicating fragrance of the lilac filled the cramped room. It smelled of hope. It smelled of freedom. It smelled of every beautiful, unbroken thing in the world. Jan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and buried his face near the delicate white blossoms. He breathed in deeply, his shoulders shaking with a sudden, silent tremor. It was a gesture of such immense, overwhelming kindness that it threatened to break the quiet stoicism he had relied on for months. Yosef reached out and gently touched the mother's hand, a silent, profound transmission of gratitude. In that small glass of water, they found the strength for another day. The lilac was a promise from the city they were meant to protect. It whispered to them that the beauty of their home was still alive, waiting patiently beneath the shadow, praying for the ice to finally crack. As the days bled into weeks, the leaves on the trees outside grew broader, casting deeper, richer shadows across the cobblestones. The waiting shifted from a sharp, frantic anxiety to a strange, suspended peace. You can only hold your breath for so long before you must eventually exhale and accept the quiet rhythm of the room. They stopped counting the days, for calendars belonged to a world they had left behind. Instead, they began to count the spring leaves. They measured the passage of time by the changing slant of the sun across the floorboards. They marked the weeks by the shifting melodies of the birds singing from the high gutters of the roof. In the evenings, when the apartment was still and the radio played its quiet, crackling lullaby, they would sit together and meticulously clean their weapons. It was a surreal, heartbreaking contrast. Their hands, gentle and steady, wiping oil across dark, heavy metal, while the scent of the white lilac still lingered in the air. They moved with the calm precision of men who have entirely accepted their fate. The fear of death had slowly burned itself out, leaving behind only a pure, concentrated core of purpose. They wrote no more letters, for there was nothing left to say that had not already been written in the quiet chambers of their hearts. They simply watched each other, these two brothers forged in the dark, ensuring that the other's resolve held strong. When Jan's eyes would drift toward the window, clouded with the sorrow of the things he would never experience, Yosef would softly begin to hum a folk song from their childhood. The melody would wrap around the room, a warm, protective blanket that brought Jan back from the edge of the abyss. There were two threads, pulled agonizingly tight across the loom of history, waiting for the precise moment the shuttle would fly. The air in the city grew heavier, sweeter, thick with the full, breathless bloom of late spring. The nights were no longer freezing, but soft and gentle. Sometimes, the father of the house would crack the window open just an inch, allowing the rhythmic, soothing hum of the cicadas and the distant, dark rush of the river to fill the room. Jan and Yosef would lie awake in the dark, listening to the heartbeat of Prague. They knew the man of polished glass still moved through these streets, his heart a hollow void of empathy, completely oblivious to the quiet, devastating power gathering in the shadows above him. The spring had arrived, beautiful and completely indifferent to the struggles of men. The lilacs had bloomed, the ice had melted, and the world had stretched its limbs toward the sun. The period of waiting, the long, psychological winter of the soul, was finally drawing to a close. The hands on the clock were aligning. The shadow was about to reach the curve in the road. And in the quiet dark, listening to the gentle breath of the city they loved, the two young men closed their eyes, their hearts perfectly, terribly still, ready at last to step out of the shadows and strike the match. There is a strange and fragile peace that rests upon the world in the final hours before everything changes forever. Imagine the city of Prague on a late spring morning, just as the sun begins to gently lift itself above the horizon. The sky is a canvas of soft, bruised peach and pale, watery blue. The river catches the early light, turning the dark, rushing water into a ribbon of liquid gold that winds its way beneath the ancient, waking bridges. The air is still cool, holding the memory of the night, but there is a promise of profound warmth in the breeze. It smells of damp cobblestones, of blooming chestnut trees, and of the sweet, rising dough from the bakeries tucked into the narrow alleyways. It is a morning so perfectly, beautifully ordinary that it almost breaks the heart. In a quiet apartment, hidden behind drawn curtains, the long night of waiting has finally ended. Jan and Josef stand in the dim light of the hallway. They are dressed not as soldiers, but as ordinary men. They wear simple suits, the fabric brushed clean, their collars neat. To look at them, you would simply see two clerks, perhaps two young teachers, preparing to join the vast, gray tide of the morning commute. But beneath the ordinary fabric of their coats, they carry the weight of a nation's sorrow. There is a profound, aching tenderness in the final movements they make within the safety of those walls. Jan reaches down to tie his leather shoe, his fingers pulling the laces tight, acutely aware that this might be the very last time he performs this simple, mundane act. He stands up, smoothing the front of his jacket, and takes a slow, deep breath of the indoor air. It smells of old floorboards, of steeped tea, and of the quiet, fierce love of the family that has sheltered them. The father of the house stands near the door. He does not offer a grand speech. He simply steps forward and places a hand on each of the young men's shoulders. His grip is firm, trembling just slightly with the immense, unspoken gravity of the moment. He looks into their eyes, and in that gaze is the gratitude of an entire captive country. The mother stands in the shadows of the kitchen, her hands pressed tightly to her lips, holding back a quiet, breaking sob. Jan and Josef give a slow, respectful nod. They turn the brass handle. The lock clicks with a sound that seems impossibly loud in the hushed apartment. And then, they step over the threshold, leaving the invisible bridge behind, and walk out into the golden, waking world. The transition from a hidden ghost to a man walking in the sunlight is a deeply surreal experience. For months, they have existed only in the shadows, speaking in whispers, jumping at the sound of a passing car. Now, they are suddenly immersed in the rushing river of humanity. They walk down the avenue, blending into the crowd. The city is alive with the gentle, rhythmic sounds of the morning. A woman briskly sweeps the dust from the front steps of her shop, her broom moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. A flock of pigeons scatters into the pale sky as a young boy runs past, a satchel of schoolbooks bouncing against his hip. And above it all is the sound of the tram. It comes grinding along the metal rails, a heavy, reassuring rumble that vibrates through the soles of their shoes, punctuated by the bright, clear chime of the brass bell. Ding, a sound so utterly familiar, so deeply tethered to the heartbeat of the city. Jan and Josef board the tram, gripping the worn leather straps hanging from the ceiling. The carriage sways gently as it moves. The air inside is warm, smelling of damp wool, faint tobacco, and the sleepy breath of the passengers. Look at the faces of the people swaying alongside them. There is a tired nurse gazing blankly out the window. There is an elderly man with a worn hat, reading a folded newspaper. There is a young mother softly bouncing a quiet infant on her shoulder. They are all so beautiful in their ordinary fatigue, so entirely unaware that they are standing inches away from the very edge of history. Jan looks at the sleeping baby. He watches the tiny, perfect rise and fall of the infant's chest. A wave of profound, sweeping love washes over him. This is why he left the safe harbor. This is why he fell through the freezing dark. He is not here out of hatred for the man of polished glass. He is here out of a desperate, overflowing love for that sleeping child. He is here to buy them a future where they can walk these streets without fear, where the music can once again spill freely from the open windows. The tram grinds to a halt. The doors open with a soft hiss of air. Jan and Josef step down onto the pavement. They walk toward a specific curve in the road. It is a sharp, hairpin bend, a place where the avenue sweeps steeply down and twists back upon itself. It is a quiet intersection, bathed in the dappled sunlight falling through the leaves of the overarching trees. It looks like a place where lovers might meet for a quiet stroll, or where a poet might sit on a wooden bench to watch the clouds drift by. It does not look like a place where the winter will finally be broken. But it is the curve that matters. A machine, no matter how powerful, no matter how sleek and dark, must bow to the laws of the earth. When a car approaches this sharp, unyielding bend, it must slow down. It must hesitate. And in that brief, suspended moment of hesitation, the impenetrable armor of the shadow can be pierced. They take their positions on the sidewalk, separating by just a few paces. They do not look at each other. They must appear simply as two men waiting for the next tram to arrive. The waiting begins again, but this time, it is different. It is not the slow, agonizing stretch of months in a dark room. It is the razor-sharp, breathless wait of the final hour. Every single second feels impossibly heavy. The sunlight rests warmly on Yosef's shoulders. Over his arm, he carries a folded raincoat, a simple garment meant to hide the cold, heavy metal of the weapon beneath it. The coat feels heavier than a mountain. He tries to focus on his breathing. Inhale the sweet, spring air. Exhale the fear. He feels his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, desperate bird trying to escape its cage. He wonders, in a fleeting, quiet thought, if the people walking past can hear the beating of his heart. Down the street, a young woman walks by holding a bouquet of wildflowers. She catches Jan's eye and offers a small, polite, fleeting smile. Jan smiles back. It is a genuine smile. It is a smile that holds all the sorrow and all the beauty of the world. He grips the handle of his leather briefcase. Inside rests a terrible, shattering force, but he holds it as gently as one might hold a sleeping bird. He feels a strange, profound sense of peace settling over him. The fear of death, which had haunted him in the freezing forests and the damp English barracks, has entirely evaporated. He is exactly where he is supposed to be. He is the thread that has finally reached the very center of the loom. The minutes drip by like slow, golden honey. The tram bell rings in the distance. The leaves rustle in the gentle wind. How surreal it is that the world does not stop spinning when a man is about to offer his life. The earth does not hold its breath. The clouds do not pause their drifting. The universe simply continues its quiet, indifferent turning, leaving the affairs of the heart entirely to the mortals who beat upon its surface. Yosef looks down at his hands. They are steady. The trembling has stopped. He thinks of his friend, standing just a few yards away, carrying the exact same monumental burden. They are entirely alone in a crowd of people, two islands of absolute, terrifying resolve in a sea of ordinary morning routines. And then, a subtle shift occurs in the air. It is not a loud noise. It is a feeling. A low, rhythmic vibration that begins to hum through the ancient cobblestones beneath their feet. The sounds of the city, the distant voices, the chirping birds, the rustling leaves, seem to suddenly fade away, pulled into a deep, silent vacuum. The world narrows down to a single, hyper-focused point in the distance, where the avenue disappears around the bend. The vibration grows steadily heavier. It is the deep, throaty growl of a powerful engine. It is the sound they have heard in their nightmares. It is the sound of the absolute winter, rolling smoothly and confidently through the warm spring morning. Jan's grip tightens just a fraction of an inch on his briefcase. Yosef's hand slips silently beneath the fold of the raincoat. The sunlight seems to catch in the air, freezing time into a series of beautiful, agonizingly slow photographs. A single green leaf falls from the branch above, twisting and turning lazily in the breeze, completely oblivious to the sudden, breathless tension that has seized the street. The engine grows louder. The shadow is approaching the curve. The man of polished glass, sitting comfortably in his open, dark car, believes he is the master of this city. He believes the streets belong to him, that the people are merely ghosts bowing to his will. He does not know that love is waiting for him on the corner. He does not know that the quiet, everyday heroism of 1,000 whispered secrets has culminated in the hands of two young men standing in the sun. The black nose of the sleek, heavy car appears around the bend. The sunlight flashes brilliantly off its polished chrome, a blinding, arrogant light. Jan takes a slow, final breath of the sweet spring air. Josef steps forward, his shadow falling across the cobblestones. The car begins to slow, bowing to the curve of the ancient road. The world holds its breath, suspended in the impossibly quiet space between the ticking of the clock, waiting for the glass to shatter. There is a fraction of a second, entirely invisible to the passing world, where man realizes that fate has quietly closed its hand. As the heavy, dark car begins to bow to the sharp curve of the ancient road, the entire world seems to hold its breath. The engine, which had been a low, arrogant roar echoing against the stone buildings, drops into a deep, struggling hum. The vehicle is forced to slow, its polished black metal gliding through the dappled sunlight that falls through the canopy of the chestnut trees. Inside the open back seat sits the man of polished glass, his pale eyes looking forward, entirely unaware that the winter he brought to this city is about to meet the sudden, violent heat of the spring. Josef stands on the pavement, just a few feet away. The warm morning breeze brushes against his cheek, carrying the sweet, heavy scent of blooming lilacs. He does not feel the warmth. His body is entirely consumed by a cold, sharp clarity. The trembling that had plagued him in the long, dark nights of waiting is completely gone. In this final, suspended moment, there is only the rhythmic, drumming beat of his own heart, echoing in his ears like a deep, solitary drum. He steps off the curb. The movement is incredibly smooth, born of 1,000 silent rehearsals in damp, lonely forests. He lets the folded raincoat slip from his arm, the fabric falling away to reveal the heavy, dark metal of the weapon he has carried across an ocean and through the freezing sky. He raises it. He aligns his gaze. He is no longer simply a young man from the deep woods. He is the concentrated sorrow of a captive nation, standing in the sunlight, demanding an answer. He pulls the trigger. We expect thunder. We expect the world to tear open with a deafening roar, a great, righteous fire to sweep across the cobblestones and consume the shadow. But there is no fire. There is no thunder. There is only a click. It is a tiny, hollow, metallic sound. A tiny failure of springs and iron. In the grand, sweeping history of the world, it is a sound so small it should not even register. But to Josef, standing entirely exposed in the bright spring morning, that tiny click is the loudest, most devastating sound in the universe. It is the sound of a promise breaking. And in that exact moment, the clock of the world simply stops. Time, which had been rushing forward like a dark, swollen river, suddenly freezes into a solid, unmoving block of ice. Look at the street in this suspended second. A few yards away, a woman has turned her head at the sudden movement, her mouth slightly open, a single breath trapped in her throat. A tram in the distance seems painted onto the background, its brass bell silenced. A pigeon, startled from a nearby gutter, hangs motionless in the air, its wings spread wide against the pale blue sky. And there is Josef, frozen in a posture of desperate intent, holding a useless piece of cold metal. The betrayal of the machine is absolute. He had trusted the heavy iron to speak for the weeping mothers and the silenced fathers, and the iron has refused to speak. A profound, crushing wave of despair washes over him. It is a sorrow so deep it transcends his own impending death. He is not afraid of falling on these cobblestones, he is terrified of leaving his people in the dark. He feels the invisible bridge of kindness, built by so many brave, quiet hands, crumbling beneath his feet. In the back of the dark car, the man of polished glass turns his head. For the first time, the Titan of winter looks directly into the eyes of the spring. The man who had moved millions of lives like paper files across a desk, the man who had never felt the tender, beating rhythm of a human heart, is suddenly confronted by the raw, desperate humanity of a single boy standing in the road. What passes between them in that frozen, silent second? There is no grand dialogue. There is only a terrifying realization. The tyrant stands up, his hand reaching for his own weapon, his face twisting not with fear, but with a cold, mechanical anger. He is a machine whose perfect, uninterrupted operation has suddenly been challenged. But for the very first time, the glass is cracked. In the reflection of Yosef's terrified, heartbroken eyes, the tyrant suddenly sees his own absolute mortality. The clock remains stopped. The silence is agonizing, a heavy, suffocating pressure pressing against the eardrums. Yosef is trapped in a nightmare, his finger pulling frantically, uselessly, against the jammed metal, trying to force the universe to correct its terrible mistake. He is entirely alone in the center of the sunlit road, a solitary thread about to be cut. But he is not alone. Standing in the shadows of the swaying trees, just a few paces away, is January. Jan sees the dropped coat. He hears the hollow click. He sees the terrifying, suspended tableau of his brother standing defenseless before the architect of their misery. Instinct is a deeply mysterious thing. It bypasses the slow, heavy machinery of logic and thought. It lives in the blood. It lives in the profound, unspoken bond forged in the dark corners of exile, and the shared cigarettes and the quiet cups of tea. Jan does not pause to calculate the odds. He does not weigh the terrifying consequences. He sees his friend trapped in the frozen amber of the stopped clock, and he simply moves. He steps out of the shadow. His hand dives deep into his leather briefcase, his fingers wrapping around a heavy, rounded object. It is cold. It is dense. It holds the devastating power to shatter the frozen world and force the clock to start ticking once again. He pulls it from the leather bag. He does not shout. He does not close his eyes. With a smooth, desperate grace, driven entirely by the fierce, protective love for the man standing in the road, Jan throws the heavy object toward the dark car. Watch it tumble through the sweet spring air. It moves in a slow, hypnotic arc, a dark seed cast into the golden morning light. It catches the reflection of the sun as it turns, over and over, passing through the space between the blooming chestnut trees and the polished chrome of the vehicle. It is a tiny, fragile vessel holding a monumental storm. It strikes the back of the car, and the world violently, instantly fractures. The stopped clock shatters. It is not just a sound, it is a profound, physical rupture of reality. The explosion rips the quiet morning apart, a concussive wave of heat and pressure that violently pushes the breath from the lungs. It is a heavy, deafening sigh from the earth itself. The beautiful, ordinary peace of the Golden City is instantly swept away, replaced by a blinding flash of yellow light and a roaring, tearing chaos. The polished glass is finally broken. The blast wave lifts the heavy metal of the car, tearing it open like fragile paper. It sends a shower of shattered windows cascading across the cobblestones, the glass tinkling and dancing like falling, deadly rain. A thick, dark cloud of dust and smoke instantly blooms into the air, swallowing the sunlight, smelling sharply of burnt powder, scorched wool, and pulverized stone. The force of the breaking whirl throws Jan back into the shadows of the pavement. He falls hard against the ancient stone of a building, the air knocked violently from his chest. In the center of the street, Yosef is entirely engulfed by the blinding smoke and the deafening noise. The world around him has become a swirling, terrifying void of gray and black. And then, just as suddenly as the storm erupted, a new, surreal stillness descends. It is not the peaceful silence of the falling snow. It is the muted, ringing silence of shock. The ears cannot process the magnitude of the sound, and so they offer only a high, distant whine. The dust begins to settle over the street, falling slowly through the shafts of returning sunlight like a strange, gray snow in the middle of spring. It coats the cobblestones, the blooming lilacs, and the abandoned briefcase in a thick, ghostly powder. Through the haze, the shapes of the world slowly begin to reappear. The dark car is mangled, a broken shell resting at an unnatural angle. The untouchable armor of the occupation has been violently pierced. The man of ice is no longer sitting tall and proud. The winter he carried within him has been fundamentally, fatally wounded. The terrifying illusion of his invincibility is lying in pieces among the shattered glass. Jan pushes himself up from the pavement, his hands scraping against the rough stone. His head is spinning, his vision blurred by the smoke and the blinding sting of the dust. He looks frantically toward the center of the road, his heart seizing with a new, terrifying fear. Where is he? Through the parting smoke, a figure emerges. It is Josef. He is covered in gray dust, his suit torn, his face pale and marked by the violent rush of the blast. He is stumbling, disoriented, but he is moving. He is alive. They lock eyes across the fractured distance of the street. There is no time for relief. There is no time to realize the monumental weight of what they have just done. The human instinct for survival, deeply buried under months of noble sacrifice, suddenly screams to the surface. The clock is ticking again, faster and more violently than ever before. The shock of the explosion will soon give way to the terrifying roar of the occupation's wrath. The sleeping dragon has been struck, and the fire is coming. Josef drops the useless, jammed weapon onto the cobblestones. It lands with a heavy, final clatter, abandoned in the gray snow. He turns. Jan turns. They do not look back at the broken car. They do not look at the fallen tyrant. They cast one last, fleeting look at the blooming chestnut trees, breathing in a ragged gulp of the smoke-filled air, and they begin to run. They plunge into the narrow, winding alleyways of their beloved city, their boots slipping on the dusted stones, racing against the approaching sirens, disappearing into the beautiful, terrifying labyrinth of the Golden City as the true, dark storm finally begins to break. There is a terrifying, beautiful purity to the moment you realize you can never, ever go back. When the world fractures, the mind does not immediately comprehend the vastness of the break. It does not calculate the shifting of empires or the turning of the pages of history. It narrows its focus down to the absolute, vital essentials of survival. It narrows down to the desperate drawing of breath into burning lungs, and the rapid, rhythmic striking of leather boots against ancient stone. Listen to the sound of those footfalls on the pavement. In the immediate aftermath of the shattering blast, that sound was the only thing tethering Jan and Josef to the earth. The golden morning had been torn violently open, the sweet air suddenly thick with the gray, choking dust of pulverized cobblestone and the sharp, metallic tang of scorched iron. Behind them lay the broken shell of the dark car, a monument to the sudden vulnerability of the tyrant. But there was no time to look back. There was only the urgent, screaming instinct to run. They plunged into the labyrinth of Prague. This city, with its 100 watchful spires and its winding, serpentine alleyways, is a place where shadows have lived for centuries. The streets do not run in straight, logical lines, they curve and bend, folding back upon themselves like a beautiful, complex puzzle built of sandstone and brick. In times of peace, it is a city designed for quiet wandering. But on this morning, it became a terrifying, twisting maze. To run for your life is a profoundly isolating experience. Even though the streets were filled with people, Jan and Josef were entirely alone, trapped in a bubble of rushing adrenaline. The ordinary citizens of the city were frozen in a strange, surreal tableau of confusion. A butcher stood in his open doorway, a white apron tied around his waist, his head turned toward the distant echo of the explosion. A group of young students halted on the corner, their textbooks clutched to their chests, their eyes wide with uncomprehending fear. The two young men wove through these frozen figures like ghosts. They could not stop to explain. They could not offer a comforting word. They were carrying the lightning, and anyone who stood too close would surely be burned. The physical toll of the escape was immense. Adrenaline is a magnificent, terrible fire. It gives you the strength to tear yourself away from the abyss, but it consumes you from the inside out. As they ran deeper into the narrow alleys, away from the wide, sunlit avenues, the fire began to burn down, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. Joseph leaned against the rough, cool stone of a building, dragging the sweet spring air into his lungs in ragged, tearing gasps. His ears were ringing with a high, sustained note, a lingering phantom of the blast that refused to fade. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling violently, coated in a fine layer of pale gray dust. His neatly brushed suit, the disguise of an ordinary clerk, was torn at the shoulder, the wool smelling faintly of smoke. He closed his eyes, pressing the side of his face against the ancient stone, seeking its solid, unyielding permanence. The memory of the jammed weapon, that tiny, hollow click, still haunted him, a heavy stone sitting in the bottom of his stomach. He had stood before the man of polished glass and failed, only to be saved by the fierce, desperate love of his brother. A few streets away, moving through a different vein of the city, Jan pushed himself forward. His side ached with a dull, throbbing pain where the blast wave had thrown him against the pavement. He kept his head bowed, pulling the brim of his hat low over his eyes. Every time he passed a uniformed patrol, even at a distance, his heart would seize, a cold hand wrapping tightly around his ribs. He forced himself to slow his pace, to mimic the confused, hurried walk of a frightened citizen rather than the desperate sprint of a hunted man. It is a terrible, agonizing performance, to force your body to move with casual grace when every instinct is screaming at you to fly. As the minutes stretched on, the initial shock of the explosion began to ripple outward, waking the sleeping dragon of the occupation. It began softly. A distant shout. The sudden, frantic blowing of a patrolman's whistle. And then, rising above the rooftops, cutting through the gentle morning air, came the sound of the sirens. It was a low, mournful wailing, a haunting, mechanical howl that swelled and multiplied until it seemed to echo from every corner of the sky. It was the sound of the absolute winter mobilizing its wrath. The man of ice had been struck, and the machinery of vengeance was spinning to life. The beautiful, blooming city of Prague was no longer a home, it was a cage, and the doors were slamming shut. The realization of what they had truly done began to settle over them, heavier than the gray dust on their coats. They had achieved the impossible. They had reached the unreachable man. But the cost of striking the match was the inevitable, consuming fire. They knew the tyrant's empire did not possess a shred of mercy. They knew the shadow would fall indiscriminately upon the innocent families, the gentle shopkeepers, the quiet mothers and fathers who had simply wished to live in peace. This is the agonizing, crushing burden of the spark. To fight the dark, you must sometimes summon a storm, knowing full well that the rain will fall on those you love most. Jan walked through a narrow courtyard, entirely consumed by this sorrow. He looked at the closed doors and the drawn curtains around him, his heart weeping for the suffering that was about to descend upon these ancient stones. He needed a refuge. Even a momentary one. A place to stop, to breathe, to wipe the damning ash from his clothes. He slipped into a small, shadowed archway that opened into a dim, quiet stairwell. The air inside smelled of damp plaster and old wood. He sank down onto the bottom step, dropping his face into his hands. The trembling was uncontrollable now. The magnificent, terrible weight of destiny had been lifted, leaving him entirely hollowed out, a fragile shell of a boy from the country. And then, he heard the soft, shuffling sound of footsteps on the landing above. He froze. His hand moved instinctively toward his coat pocket, his muscles tensing for a final, desperate stand. He looked up, his breath trapped in his throat. Standing on the stairs was an elderly woman. She carried a woven wicker basket filled with damp, clean laundry. She stopped, looking down at the young man huddled in the shadows of her doorway. The silence between them was profound. The sirens wailed mournfully in the distance, vibrating through the thick brick walls. She saw his torn coat. She saw the pale, gray dust clinging to his hair. She saw the absolute, naked terror in his wide, exhausted eyes. She did not need to be told what had happened. In an occupied city, the people learned to read the unspoken language of fear perfectly. She knew that the man sitting on her stairs was the cause of the sirens. She knew that simply looking at him, simply failing to scream for the patrols, could mean her own death. In a world governed by logic and self-preservation, she should have dropped her basket and run. She should have bolted the heavy wooden door and hidden under her bed. But the human heart is a magnificent, defiant thing. It does not always bow to the cold arithmetic of survival. The elderly woman did not scream. She did not run. She slowly lowered her basket to the wooden landing. She reached into the pocket of her faded apron and pulled out a small, clean, white handkerchief. She walked softly down the stairs, moving with the gentle, quiet grace of a grandmother approaching a frightened child. She stopped in front of January. She did not ask his name. She did not ask what he had done. She simply reached out, her hand trembling slightly with age, and gently wiped the dark soot and ash from his cheek. The touch of her hand was so incredibly soft. It was the touch of the mother he had left behind, the touch of the golden city itself, offering a silent, heartbreaking forgiveness. Jan closed his eyes, a single, hot tear slipping down his face, washing a clean path through the dust. She pressed the clean handkerchief into his palm and closed his fingers around it. She pointed a frail finger toward the back of the stairwell, indicating a small, wooden door that led out into a hidden alleyway, away from the main avenue and the searching patrols. "Go," she whispered. Her voice was barely louder than the rustle of a dry leaf. "Go with God, my son." She turned, picked up her heavy basket of laundry, and walked back up the stairs, disappearing into the shadows of the upper floors, taking the terrible secret with her into the quiet of her home. Jan stood up in the dim stairwell. He clutched the white piece of cloth in his hand like a sacred talisman. That small, invisible act of heroism, a stranger offering a moment of grace in the face of absolute ruin, was the very soul of the invisible bridge. It was the exact reason they had fallen from the sky. The man of polished glass could control the armies, he could control the borders, and he could strike fear into the bones of the earth, but he could never, ever reach the quiet, beautiful sanctuary of an ordinary human heart. Jan opened the heavy back door and slipped out into the narrow, winding alley. The air was thick with the scent of blooming lilacs and the distant smell of smoke. The footfalls on the pavement resumed, softer now, steadier. He had to find Joseph. He had to find the invisible bridge. The dragon was awake, the sirens were singing their terrible song, and the true, devastating winter was about to fall upon Prague once more. But as he walked deeper into the shadows, the terrified boy from the country was gone. He walked with the quiet, unbroken dignity of a man who knew that, no matter what the darkness brought, the light of his people could never truly be extinguished. Even the thickest, most unyielding ice must eventually surrender to the fever of the earth. Let us step away from the chaotic, winding alleyways and the rushing adrenaline of the sunlit streets, and enter a place of absolute, suffocating quiet. High on a hill overlooking the winding river, behind the heavy walls of a grand hospital, there is a room painted entirely in sterile, unforgiving white. The air inside smells sharply of iodine, starched cotton, and the faint, sweet edge of ether. The curtains are drawn tightly against the bright spring sunlight, plunging the room into a perpetual, artificial twilight. In the center of this quiet room rests a narrow iron bed. And lying upon the pristine white sheets is the man of polished glass. He is no longer wearing his crisp, immaculate uniforms. He is no longer sitting behind a massive oak desk, moving the lives of millions across a map with the casual flick of a fountain pen. He has been stripped of the heavy, dark armor of his empire. Now, he is dressed only in a thin, cotton hospital gown, his skin pale and damp with a cold, relentless sweat. The architect of the absolute winter has been reduced to a fragile, shivering mortal, drowning in the sudden, terrible heat of his own infected blood. There is a profound, almost poetic irony in the nature of his wound. The blast on the cobblestone street did not immediately claim his life. Instead, the force of the shattering explosive drove the very fragments of the world he so deeply despised directly into his body. splinters of rusted metal, shards of ordinary glass, and the rough, coarse horsehair stuffing from the upholstery of his luxurious car were violently embedded deep beneath his skin. He, who had spent his entire life trying to sterilize the world, trying to force the messy, beautiful, unpredictable human spirit into neat, obedient columns, had been fatally pierced by the dirt and the debris of the everyday street. The Golden City, which he had tried to freeze into submission, had fundamentally entered his veins. And the infection was spreading, a slow, invisible, and unstoppable fire. To sit in that room is to witness the ultimate, devastating frailty of human power. Outside the thick hospital doors, the halls are filled with the highest-ranking officers of the occupation. They pace the polished floors with heavy boots, their faces grim, their voices hushed in terrified whispers. They are men who can command fleets of bombers to darken the sky. They are men who can order the destruction of entire towns with a single spoken word. Yet, as they stand around this narrow iron bed, they are utterly, completely impotent. They bring in the finest surgeons. They bring in experimental medicines, rushing them across the continent in the dead of night. But all the dark, towering machinery of their empire cannot command a single, microscopic microbe to stop its deadly work. They cannot sign a decree to lower his temperature. They cannot arrest the fever that is burning him from the inside out. The absolute equalizer of death has entered the room, and it does not recognize rank, or title, or the terrifying myth of invincibility. It sees only a failing heart and a struggling breath. As the days blur into a long, agonizing twilight, the man of ice begins to slip away from the waking world. He drifts into the heavy, suffocating waters of delirium. What does a man completely devoid of empathy dream of when the end approaches? When an ordinary person is pulled into the current of a high fever, their mind usually returns to the places of deep love. They dream of the warm sun on their childhood porch, the smell of their mother's cooking, the gentle touch of a lover's hand. They find a soft, comforting refuge in their own humanity. But the man of polished glass has no such refuge. His mind is a sterile, empty architecture. In his fevered dreams, he does not see the faces of loved ones holding out their hands. Instead, perhaps he sees the endless, towering cabinets of his files slowly dissolving into gray ash. Perhaps he sees the perfect, mathematical lines of his maps melting and running like watercolor in the rain. Perhaps he hears, over and over again, the tiny, hollow click of a jammed weapon, followed by the deafening roar of a world that refused to bow to him. He tosses his head against the damp pillow, his pale lips moving in silent, frantic whispers, trying to issue orders to a shadow army that can no longer hear him. He reaches out with a trembling, pale hand, trying to grasp the edges of his fading control, but his fingers close only around the empty, conditioned air. While he burns in the absolute isolation of his sterile room, the city of Prague outside the hospital windows is holding its breath in the dark. The reprisal has begun, sweeping through the ancient streets like a blind, thrashing leviathan. The sirens wail through the night, a constant, mournful soundtrack to the terror. The heavy boots kick at wooden doors, and the shadows fall upon the innocent. The city is bleeding, weeping for the sons and daughters who are dragged out into the cold spring nights, paying the terrible, unimaginable price for the spark that was struck at the curve in the road. But if you look very closely, past the roaring trucks and the shouting voices, you will see a profound, breathtaking contrast to the lonely death of the tyrant. You will see the people of the Golden City finding their refuge in each other. In a cramped apartment, sitting in the pitch black to avoid the gaze of the patrols, a father gathers his children onto his lap. He wraps his arms entirely around their trembling shoulders, burying his face in their soft hair. He cannot stop the soldiers from marching down the street, but he can be a shield of absolute, fiercely burning love in the center of the dark. In a cellar beneath a bakery, a group of neighbors huddles together among the sacks of flour. They share a single, hidden candle, the tiny flame casting dancing, warm shadows across their exhausted faces. An old woman reaches out and gently takes the hand of a terrified young girl she has never met before. She does not speak. She simply holds the girl's hand, rubbing her thumb slowly across the knuckles, offering the quiet, profound anchor of human touch. These are the moments the man of ice could never understand. He believed that terror would break the bonds between people, that fear would turn them against one another and leave them isolated and weak. He did not know that when the night is at its absolute darkest, the human heart instinctively seeks the warmth of another. He lies in his hospital bed, surrounded by terrified underlings who only serve him out of fear, while the ordinary citizens of the city he tried to destroy are holding each other in the dark, bound together by an enduring, unbreakable love. The news of his fading grip on life does not travel through the official newspapers or the blaring radios. It travels along the invisible bridge of the city. It is passed in the subtle, nearly imperceptible nod of a grocer handing a cabbage to a mother. It is carried in the quiet, significant glance between two strangers passing on a crowded tram. It is whispered in the darkest corners of the factories, passed from ear to ear under the deafening roar of the machinery. He is failing, the glass is melting. Even in the midst of their crushing, suffocating terror, this whispered knowledge is a tiny, glowing ember of profound hope. The people of Prague do not cheer. They do not celebrate in the streets, for the shadow is still heavy upon them, and the cost of the strike has been unimaginably high. But the terrifying myth of the monster has been fundamentally broken. They know now that the men who rule them with iron and ice are made of the exact same fragile, mortal clay as anyone else. They can be reached. They can be broken. They can be pulled down into the earth. Back in the quiet, white room on the hill, the end is drawing very near. The fever has consumed the last reserves of the tyrant's strength. His breathing has become a shallow, labored rattle, a dry, mechanical sound that echoes off the bare walls. The doctors step back from the bed, lowering their heads, their instruments entirely useless. There is a deep, profound tragedy in watching any human soul leave the physical world. But the departure of the man of polished glass is a cold, empty thing. There is no warmth in the room. There are no tears of genuine, agonizing sorrow from a heartbroken spouse or a devoted child. There is only the clinical, terrifying realization among his officers that the center of their dark architecture has collapsed. He does not have a final moment of grand revelation. The fever does not suddenly break to allow him a final, clear look at the damage he has done to the world. He simply slips further and further into the heavy, suffocating dark, until the machinery of his body finally, quietly stops. The chest rises one last, trembling time. And then, it simply does not rise again. The silence that falls over the sterile room is absolute. It is a heavy, deafening void. The man who had sought to master the world, who had believed he could redesign the human spirit through cold calculation and unyielding terror, has been entirely erased from the waking earth. He leaves behind no beautiful music, no warm memories, no legacy of kindness. He leaves behind only a sprawling, dark shadow and the lingering, bitter scent of ash. Outside the heavy hospital windows, the morning slowly begins to break over the golden city. The sky turns a soft, bruised shade of lavender, and the ancient spires of Prague catch the first, pale rays of the returning sun. The river continues its relentless, rushing journey beneath the stone bridges, completely indifferent to the passing of the tyrant. The world has not stopped turning. The chestnut trees are still blooming, their delicate white petals falling softly onto the dew-soaked cobblestones. The terror in the streets will not end today. The dragon, deeply wounded and thrashing in its pain, will lash out with a blind, terrifying fury, and the people of the city will suffer agonizingly in the days to come. The long night is far from over. But as the citizens wake in their dim apartments, pulling back the heavy curtains just an inch to let the morning light touch their tired faces, they breathe the air of a world that is fundamentally altered. The absolute winter has been pierced. The unfeeling ice has melted into the earth. And though they must still walk through the valley of shadows, they walk with the quiet, profound knowledge that even the darkest, most terrifying power is ultimately frail, and that the beautiful, Stubborn beating of the human heart will always, eventually, outlast the cold. There is a sorrow so deep it sinks into the very earth, resting quietly beneath the roots of the ancient trees. If you close your eyes and let your mind drift back to the days before the great shadow fell, you can almost see the valley cradled by rolling, gentle hills. It was a place where the wind moved softly through the tall grass, carrying the sweet, heavy scent of damp earth, blooming wildflowers, and the warm promise of summer. This was a village where time did not rush. It moved at the patient, beautiful pace of the changing seasons. Families lived in modest houses with thick plaster walls and gardens overflowing with climbing roses and heavy-laden apple trees. Children ran through the dusty lanes, their bare feet moving swiftly over the stones, their bright, untroubled laughter echoing against the walls of the old church. Fathers returned from the surrounding fields or the deep, dark mines with weary shoulders but soft, welcoming eyes, greeted by the comforting smell of baking bread and the familiar hum of a quiet, shared life. Mothers stood by the open windows, mending clothes in the fading evening light, watching the stars slowly prick through the canvas of the twilight sky. It was a place of ordinary, breathtaking beauty. A tapestry of simple, profound loves, entirely separate from the grand, terrible machinations of the war. But when the man of polished glass fell in the golden city, the shadow he left behind thrashed in a blind, agonizing fury. The empire of ice, suddenly confronted by its own fragile mortality, demanded a sacrifice. It sought a sweeping gesture of terror to cover its glaring vulnerability. And in its blind, unfeeling rage, it turned its hollow gaze toward this quiet, gentle valley. The storm did not arrive because of anything the villagers had done. They were not soldiers. They were not the architects of the resistance. They were simply there, a fragile, peaceful community resting in the path of an unimaginable vengeance. The night the shadow descended, the air was warm and still. The village was sleeping, wrapped in the soft, trusting embrace of the dark. When the heavy boots marched down the narrow lanes, they did not bring the loud, chaotic clamor of a battlefield. They brought a cold, methodical silence. It is a terrifying thing when the world you have known intimately, the safe haven you have built with your own hands, is suddenly breached by the winter. Imagine the absolute bewilderment of a father woken from his bed by a sharp knock at the door. He pulls his heavy coat over his shoulders in the dim light, his hands trembling slightly, yet he forces a calm, reassuring smile for his frightened wife. Imagine the mothers gently lifting their sleeping children from their warm beds, wrapping them in thick woolen blankets against the sudden, unnatural chill of the night, whispering soft, soothing words into their ears to keep the panic at bay. There is an agony in forced farewells that words can barely begin to touch. In the center of the village, under the pale, indifferent light of the moon, the fabric of 100 families was quietly, permanently torn apart. The fathers and the older sons were guided one way. Their faces were pale, their jaws set, their eyes searching the chaotic crowd for one last, desperate glimpse of their loved ones. They did not weep. They carried the heavy, silent dignity of men who knew they were walking toward the end of their world, wanting only to spare their families the terrifying sight of their own fear. They stood shoulder to shoulder, brothers and neighbors, farmers and miners, holding on to the quiet courage of a life well lived. The mothers, holding their children impossibly tight against their chests, watched them go. Their hearts fractured into 1,000 irreplaceable pieces. In those few, fleeting seconds of separation, entire lifetimes of love were communicated in the spaces between terrified glances. A hand squeezed. A tear quickly wiped away. A silent, enduring promise whispered into the cold night, I will love you beyond this dark. I will carry you with me, no matter where the winter takes us. And then, there were the children. The little ones, bundled in their heavy coats, their eyes wide with a profound, innocent confusion. They held onto their mother's skirts, or clutched small, carved wooden toys to their chests, completely unaware of the vast, terrible hatred that had swallowed their home. They were guided away, stepping into the unknown, carried far from the rolling hills and the familiar apple trees. To think of them is to feel a deep, sweeping ache in the very center of the chest. They were the absolute essence of the valley's future, the brightest, purest lights of the community, carried away into the suffocating fog. When the people were gone, the shadow turned its wrath upon the stones. It was not enough for the Empire of Ice to steal the breath of the village. They wanted to erase its very memory from the face of the earth. The modest houses where families had shared their evening meals, the small school where children had learned to write their names in careful, curving letters, the ancient church where generations had whispered their prayers and celebrated their joys, all of it was brought down into the dust. The orchards were cruelly uprooted. The river was diverted from its natural path. Even the graves of the ancestors, resting peacefully on the hill, were turned over. By the time the sun set, the village was simply gone. It was transformed into a weeping valley, a scarred, empty expanse of earth where a beautiful, breathing community had once stood. The silence that settled over the valley was not the peaceful, comforting silence of a falling snow. It was a heavy, suffocating absence. It was the silence of a stopped clock, of an empty chair at the dinner table, of a familiar song cut off before the final, lingering note. The wind still blew across the hills, but there was no laughter for it to carry. The rain still fell from the gray clouds, but there were no roofs for it to shelter. The earth itself seemed to mourn, holding the memory of the footsteps and the ruined gardens deep within its bruised soil. The men who destroyed the village believed that by turning the stones to dust and erasing the name from the maps, they could make the world forget. They believed that terror was stronger than love, and that a fire could consume the spirit just as easily as it consumes dry wood. But they were so profoundly, terribly wrong. You can burn a house, and you can uproot a tree, but you can never burn a memory. You cannot uproot the fierce, enduring love of the human spirit. As the tragic news of the Weeping Valley slipped through the invisible bridges, passed from whispered voices to hidden letters, and eventually crossed the dark oceans, something beautiful and defiantly human happened. The world refused to let the name die. In distant countries, in cities and small towns that had never known the rolling hills of the Golden City or the taste of its apples, people felt the deep, resonating sorrow of the lost village. Mothers looked at their newborn daughters, wrapped in warm, safe blankets, and gave them the name of the Lost Valley. Communities across the sea changed the names of their own streets, their own squares, and their own parks, carving the memory of the innocent into their own stone. The village that was meant to be entirely erased suddenly existed everywhere. It became a whispered prayer, a universal symbol of quiet, unbreakable resilience, carried in the hearts of millions of strangers who simply refused to forget. The shadow had tried to extinguish a single candle, and in doing so, had accidentally lit 1,000 more. Decades have passed since the storm swept through the valley. The Empire of Ice is long gone, melted into the pages of history, its grand, terrifying architecture crumbled into the dust. And if you were to visit the Weeping Valley today, you would not find a barren, scarred wasteland. You would find that the earth, with its infinite, patient, and beautiful grace, has healed. The grass has returned, growing thick and vibrant green, covering the scars of the past like a soft, protective blanket. The wind moves gently through the newly planted trees, and the air smells once again of damp earth, sweet pollen, and summer rain. In the heart of the valley, where the deepest sorrow once rested, there is now a magnificent garden. It is a vast, sweeping sea of roses, planted by gentle, reverent hands from all over the world. Bush after bush, their roots reaching deep into the healing soil, bursting into breathtaking, vibrant color every spring. When the wind blows across the valley now, it carries the overwhelming, sweet fragrance of the blossoms. Every single rose is a silent, beautiful tribute to a life that was taken. Every soft, velvety petal is a testament to the fact that love will always, eventually, outlast the dark. It is a living, breathing memorial, a chorus of color rising from the earth to say that the innocent are still cherished, still mourned, and still deeply loved. And there, resting quietly in the tall grass near the roses, is a monument of bronze. It is a gathering of children, standing together, their faces turned toward the sky. They are the children of the valley, frozen in time, forever innocent, forever holding each other's hands. They do not look afraid. They look peaceful. When the winter snow falls, it rests gently on their bronze shoulders, like a soft, white quilt tucking them in for the night. When the spring sun shines, it warms their faces and casts long, gentle shadows across the green earth. Visitors come from all over the world, walking softly through the grass, and they reach out to touch the bronze hands. The metal is polished bright by the countless, tender touches of strangers wiping away tears. They are the eternal guardians of the valley, reminding everyone who walks the path of the precious, fragile beauty of peace, and the absolute sanctity of an ordinary life. Let us send a quiet, gentle thought into the dark, across the years and the miles, to the souls of the weeping valley. We see you. We remember the gardens you tended with such care, the bread you baked to feed your families, the quiet lullabies you sang in the dim evening light. We remember the quiet, steady courage of the fathers, standing tall in the face of the abyss. We remember the fierce, boundless, and overwhelming love of the mothers, holding their children tight against the cold. And we remember the bright, pure light of the children, whose laughter still echoes in the wind that moves through the roses. Your sorrow is held gently in the heart of the world. Your memory is a bridge of light, stretching across the darkest, coldest parts of history. You teach us to hold our own loved ones a little closer, to cherish the simple, ordinary beauty of our days, and to fiercely protect the quiet, peaceful valleys of the earth. Rest now, in the soft, green embrace of the hills. The storm has finally passed. The dark has retreated back into the shadows. The roses are blooming in the valley, their roots tangled together beneath the earth, and the wind is singing a gentle, enduring song of peace. Sleep well, surrounded by the warmth of a world that will never, ever let you fade. There is a profound, holy peace that can only be found when you have descended completely out of the reach of the sun. Imagine the heavy, ancient wooden doors of a stone church slowly closing, groaning on their iron hinges, sealing away the frantic, roaring terror of the occupied city above. Beneath the soaring arches and the beautifully colored light of the stained glass, hidden far below the polished marble floors, lies an entirely different world. It is a world carved from the very bedrock of the earth. These are the catacombs. A place originally designed for the quiet, eternal rest of the faithful, now transformed by the terrifying grace of war into a fragile, breathing sanctuary for the hunted. When Jan and Josef finally slipped down the narrow, winding stone steps, leaving the blinding sunlight and the wailing sirens behind them, the transition was like stepping into a deep, cool, and silent ocean. The air down here does not move. It is heavy, thick, and profoundly still. It carries the smell of damp limestone, ancient, undisturbed dust, and the faint, sweet, lingering memory of frankincense burned decades ago. The deafening roar of the military trucks and the sharp, terrifying crack of heavy boots on the cobblestones above are entirely muffled. They are reduced to distant, indistinct vibrations, mere ghosts of sound passing through the thick, arched stone ceiling. Here, deep in the earth, the absolute winter of the occupation cannot reach. They were not alone in the dark. As their eyes slowly adjusted to the profound, heavy blackness, small, warm pools of golden light began to gently emerge from the shadows. Candles. Tiny, flickering sentinels placed carefully in the carved alcoves of the ancient walls. And gathered around these small, brave flames was a quiet brotherhood. Other young men, other threads of the resistance who had also cast their own sparks into the night, had found their way through the labyrinth of the city to this hidden refuge. Imagine the profound, overwhelming wave of relief that washes over a soul when seeing a familiar face in the dim light after walking through the fire. There were no loud cheers in the crypt. There were no sudden, joyous shouts of victory. The danger above was far too near, and the deep reverence of the space demanded a hushed, sacred respect. Instead, there were fierce, silent embraces. Heavy, exhausted heads resting on the woolen shoulders of brothers. hands tightly gripping arms, silently transmitting the incredible, miraculous truth, we are still here. We survived the storm, The invisible bridge of ordinary citizens that had carried them so bravely through the trembling city had finally led them into the hands of quiet, holy men. The priests of the church moved through the damp catacombs like gentle, benevolent shadows. They wore dark robes that blended seamlessly into the gloom, their footsteps making no sound on the worn stone floors. These men of faith did not judge. They did not ask for the terrifying details of the fire that had been lit in the streets above. They simply looked into the dark and saw young men who were unimaginably tired, hunted, and afraid. In response, they offered the absolute, unconditional sanctuary of their walls. Their heroism was a steady, quiet flame. They risked the ultimate, devastating wrath of the tyrant simply to bring small woven baskets containing meager rations of dark bread, perhaps a few soft apples, and heavy metal canteens filled with fresh, cold water. They were the silent shepherds of the dark, wrapping the assassins in a protective cloak of profound empathy. In the damp, quiet embrace of the crypt, the rigid, demanding structure of time ceased to exist. Without the rising and setting of the sun to mark the passing of the hours, the days and nights blurred together into one long, continuous, and peaceful twilight. The men lived entirely by the gentle lifespan of the candles. When a wick burned low, drowning in a small, warm pool of translucent wax, another taper was gently lit from its dying flame, ensuring that the ancient dark never fully claimed the room. In this suspended, subterranean reality, the men found a deeply moving, beautiful comfort in the simplest of routines. It is a remarkable testament to the human spirit that, even while hiding in a tomb, we will instinctively try to build a home. They sat together on thick woolen blankets spread carefully over the cold, uneven stone floor. They shared the precious bread brought by the priests, breaking the small loaves with careful, reverent hands, making absolutely sure that every man received an equal share. There is a sacred, unspoken communion in sharing food in the dark. It is a quiet promise of survival. It is tangible, physical proof that you are part of a family, that you have not been abandoned to the night. Watch them in the golden, flickering light. One young man spends an hour meticulously cleaning a pair of spectacles, wiping the fragile lenses with the corner of his cotton shirt until they catch the candle light perfectly. Another sits cross-legged with a needle and a spool of dark thread, carefully mending a jagged tear in his trousers, his face a beautiful portrait of quiet, focused calm. Jan and Yosef sit close together, their backs resting against the cool, curved wall of a burial niche. They do not need to speak of the street corner. They do not need to replay the terrifying silence of the jammed weapon or the deafening roar of the breaking glass. The heavy, shattering weight of what they had done was left at the heavy wooden doors far above their heads. Down here, they are no longer soldiers carrying the fate of a nation. They are simply two young men from the country, finally finding a moment of rest. Have you ever stared deeply into the flame of a single candle in a completely dark room? It is a mesmerizing, hypnotic thing. It pulls your racing thoughts inward, slowing the frantic beating of your heart. The men in the catacombs spent countless, silent hours watching the tiny, dancing tongues of fire. In the warm, golden glow, the damp, rough-hewn stone walls seemed to soften, taking on the welcoming, comforting hue of a childhood hearth. In that quiet light, their minds drifted back across the channel, returning to the letters they had written in the damp English countryside. They thought of the white envelopes safely locked away in a dark drawer, waiting patiently in the silence. They thought of their mothers, their fathers, the sweethearts who would one day open those envelopes and read the unspoken goodbyes. But the thoughts of home were no longer frantic. They were no longer filled with the sharp, agonizing despair of the unknown. A strange, sweeping, and beautiful peace had settled over the crypt. They had completed the impossible task they had been given. They had struck the match, and they knew the fire was burning. The agonizing months of waiting, the terrifying parachute drop into the freezing snow, the excruciating tension of standing in the sunlit street, it was all behind them now. There was nothing left to do but wait, and breathe, and rest. The profound comfort they found in each other's company was an absolute shield against the terror of the world. When one man would stir from a nightmare in the night, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as the memories of the blast invaded his sleep, another would simply reach out in the dark and rest a heavy, reassuring hand on his knee. "I am here," the touch would say. "We are together." That silent, gentle touch in the dark was more powerful than any weapon they had carried. It was the physical manifestation of the deep, brotherly love that had driven them to fall from the sky in the first place. It was the warmth of the human soul pushing back against the cold. Sometimes, in the deepest, most quiet part of the twilight, a voice would softly rise. It was not a loud song, and it was never boastful. It was a gentle, resonant hum, barely a whisper. A hymn from their childhood, or a soft, melancholy folk song about the rolling golden hills and the deep, silent forests of their youth. The melody would drift upward through the vaulted arches of the catacombs, wrapping gently around the thick stone pillars, a beautiful, fragile ribbon of sound floating in the dark. The other men would close their eyes, leaning their heads back against the stone, letting the music wash over them. The song carried them far away from the damp stone and the buried dark. It carried them home. They knew, of course, that the world above them was burning. They could feel the occasional, heavy shudder of the earth when a convoy of military trucks rumbled past the church outside. They knew the man of polished glass had fallen, and they knew that the shadow, entirely consumed by its own blinding rage, was tearing the beautiful city apart in a desperate search for them. But sitting in the crypt, bathed in the soft, yellow light of the candles, that terror felt like a fierce storm raging on the other side of a very thick pane of glass. You can see the lightning flash in the distance, you can see the ancient trees bending and thrashing in the violent wind, but you are warm, and you are dry, and the freezing rain cannot touch you. For these few, suspended, and beautiful days, the men hidden beneath the earth were not assassins. They were not hunted ghosts running breathlessly through the winding alleys. They were a quiet congregation of beautiful, weary souls, seeking warmth in the cold embrace of the earth. They had become a family of the dark, bound together by a love so fierce and a courage so deep it had fundamentally altered the course of history. As they lay down to sleep on the hard stone, wrapping their torn coats tightly around their shoulders against the damp chill, they watched the candles slowly burning down, the wax pooling softly on the rock. They listened to the slow, steady, reassuring breathing of their brothers sleeping beside them. And in the deep, holy, and untouched quiet of the catacombs, they found a profound, perfect peace. They rested gently in the arms of the earth, holding onto the light, completely unaware of how close the final morning truly was. There is a breaking point in every human heart, a quiet, fragile line where courage simply runs out of breath. When we tell stories of the past, we so often paint the world in bold, absolute strokes of light and dark. We sing of the heroes who stand entirely unbroken in the face of the storm, and we speak of the villains whose hearts are made of unfeeling ice. But the truth of the human condition is far more delicate and far more tragic. Most of us are not made of solid granite. We are made of soft, breathing clay. We are made of memories, of attachments, of profound and terrifying loves. And when the weight of the world is pressed down upon us, slowly and relentlessly, even the most beautiful clay will eventually begin to crack. While Jan and Joseph sat in the warm, candlelit embrace of the church catacombs, surrounded by the quiet comfort of their brothers, there was another thread from their parachute drop who had become entirely separated from the tapestry. He was another young man, another boy from the country who had leaped into the freezing winter sky with a heart full of noble intentions. But unlike his friends in the crypt, he was not surrounded by the protective walls of the sanctuary. He was isolated. He was alone. He had sought refuge far from the winding alleyways of the Golden City, retreating to the quiet, rolling hills of the countryside where his mother lived. He hid in the familiar shadows of his childhood home, sleeping in a barn that smelled of sweet, dry hay and old wood. In the beginning, perhaps he felt a fragile sense of safety there. He could hear the soothing, rhythmic sounds of the farm animals in the night. He could look out through the gaps in the wooden boards and see the same stars he had wished upon as a child. But isolation is a very dangerous room for a frightened mind to inhabit. In the catacombs, fear was a burden shared among many shoulders. When the terror crept in, there was always a hand to hold, a voice to hum a gentle melody, a candle to push back the dark. In the solitary confinement of the barn, there was only the suffocating silence. There was only the echoing chamber of his own mind, left alone to wander through a terrifying labyrinth of worst-case scenarios. And then, the news of the Weeping Valley reached the countryside. The story of Lidice, the erased village, the vanished fathers, the weeping mothers, the stolen children, drifted through the invisible bridge and seeped under the heavy wooden doors of the barn. For Jan and Josef in the crypt, this news was a devastating sorrow that strengthened their solemn resolve. They knew they had to endure. But for the young man hiding alone in the hay, the news was a heavy, shattering blow that struck directly at the very foundation of his sanity. Fear does not always roar. Most often, it whispers. It is a slow, dripping leak in the ceiling of the mind, wearing away the stone drop by agonizing drop. He sat in the dim light of the barn, wrapping his arms around his knees, and he listened to the whispers. The shadow, thrashing in its blind fury over the death of the man of polished glass, had issued a terrifying ultimatum across the captive country. The Empire of Ice declared that anyone hiding the assassins, anyone who knew their names, anyone who even suspected their whereabouts, would be executed alongside their entire family. Entire family, those two words echoed in the young man's mind, a rhythmic, maddening drumbeat. He looked through the wooden slats of the barn toward the small, modest farmhouse. He saw the warm, yellow light glowing in the kitchen window. He saw the silhouette of his mother moving slowly across the glass, her shoulders bent with age and weariness. He loved her with a fierce, profound devotion. She was the woman who had baked his bread, mended his torn trousers, and sung him to sleep when the winter winds howled outside their door. The whispers in his mind grew louder. He pictured the heavy leather boots marching up the dirt path to her front door. He pictured the men of ice dragging her out into the cold morning air. He saw her standing before the rifles, paying the ultimate, agonizing price simply because she had loved her son enough to offer him the shelter of her barn. How heavy is the sky when you are the one holding it up? How do you weigh the life of the brother you swore to protect against the life of the mother who gave you breath? It is easy, from the safe distance of history, to look back and pass a harsh, unforgiving judgment. It is easy to demand absolute perfection from men pushed to the very edge of the abyss. But true empathy asks us to step into the dark with them. It asks us to feel the crushing, unimaginable pressure wrapping tightly around his chest. It asks us to recognize that courage is a finite resource, and sometimes, a person simply runs out. He stopped sleeping. The dark circles beneath his eyes grew deep and bruised. Every sudden rustle of the wind in the dry grass made his heart seize with a violent, painful jolt. Every distant hum of a motorized engine sent a wave of nausea washing over him. The psychological torture of the occupation, the constant, unyielding threat of ruin hanging over the heads of the innocent, was a machine designed perfectly to break the human spirit. And it was working. He began to believe a terrifying lie, a lie born of sheer, exhausted desperation. He began to believe that if he simply surrendered, if he simply gave the shadow what it wanted, the screaming would stop. He believed he could trade a secret for his mother's life. He believed he could bargain with the winter. The morning he finally broke was not marked by a sudden, dramatic collapse. It was a slow, quiet yielding. It was the sound of a beautiful, fragile thread finally snapping under an impossible tension. He climbed down from the hayloft. He brushed the dry straw from his coat with trembling, numb fingers. He did not go to the farmhouse to say goodbye to his mother. He knew that if he looked into her kind, weary eyes, his resolve to do this terrible thing would vanish, and the agonizing cycle of terror would simply continue. He turned his back on the rolling hills of his youth, his shoulders slumped, his chest hollowed out, and he began the long, heavy walk back toward the Golden City. Imagine the agonizing sorrow of that journey. He was a ghost walking among the living. He sat on a crowded train, watching the green spring countryside rolling past the window, but he saw none of it. He was entirely consumed by the profound, devastating shame of what he was about to do. He loved January. He loved Joseph. He had shared the damp English fog with them, the quiet cups of tea, the freezing fall through the night sky. He was carrying their lives in his hands, walking slowly toward the fire, preparing to drop them into the flames. When he finally arrived in the streets of Prague, the city felt entirely alien. The cobblestones, once so familiar and comforting, felt like a long, paved road leading directly into the underworld. The sky above was a pale, indifferent gray, offering a soft, drizzling rain that matched the profound weeping of his own soul. He walked down the wide avenue toward the headquarters of the occupation. It was a grand, imposing building, a fortress of stone and polished glass where the shadow did its darkest work. The very sight of it made the breath catch in his throat. His feet felt like they were made of heavy iron. Every step required a monumental, agonizing effort of will. He stopped across the street, standing in the gentle rain. He looked at the heavy wooden doors of the building. He stood there for a long time, a solitary, broken figure in a damp wool coat. In his mind, two terrifying forces were waging a final, desperate battle. On one side, the beautiful, sacred bond of brotherhood. On the other, the desperate, blinding terror for his mother's life. It is the greatest tragedy of the human heart that sometimes, love can be twisted into a weapon against itself. It was not malice that drove him across the street. It was not a desire for gold, or a hatred for his friends. It was a broken, desperate love. It was the frantic, thrashing instinct to save a single, precious life from the jaws of the Leviathan, even if it meant sacrificing his own soul in the process. He crossed the wet cobblestones. He reached out with a trembling hand and pushed the heavy door open. The air inside the building was cold and sterile, smelling of ink, damp wool, and fear. He walked down a long, dimly lit hallway, the sound of his own footsteps echoing mockingly against the walls. He was guided into a sparse, brightly lit office. Behind a wooden desk sat a man in a crisp, dark uniform, his eyes sharp and unfeeling. The interrogator did not need to use the tools of physical torture. He simply looked at the young man standing before him, seeing the trembling hands, the hollow, exhausted eyes, the absolute devastation written in the lines of his face. The interrogator knew that the psychological machine had already done the work. The young man opened his mouth. His throat was painfully dry. The words he was about to speak were a poison he had to swallow. He closed his eyes, squeezing them shut against the harsh light, trying to push away the memory of the gentle smiles and the shared warmth of his brothers. He did not shout their names. He did not speak with the firm, clear voice of a soldier. He spoke in a hoarse, defeated whisper. He gave them the name of a family on the invisible bridge. He gave them the thread that, once pulled, would unravel the entire magnificent tapestry of quiet heroism that had kept the assassins safe. He spoke the whisper in the dark, and in doing so, he extinguished his own light forever. When he was done, he sat in the wooden chair, completely empty. The overwhelming wave of relief he had desperately hoped for did not come. Instead, a new, far more terrible weight settled over his shoulders. It was the crushing, eternal weight of guilt. He had saved his mother, perhaps, but he had condemned his brothers, and he had condemned himself to live the rest of his days in a prison of his own making. We must look upon this broken man with a profound, gentle pity. The machinery of war is a cruel, unnatural thing. It demands that ordinary men, boys who should have been tending apple orchards or holding the hands of their sweethearts, carry the impossible burdens of gods. When a back breaks under that weight, it is not a failure of the soul, it is a failure of the world that placed a burden there to begin with. The whisper in the dark had been spoken. The terrifying machinery of the shadow, which had been thrashing blindly through the city, suddenly had a direction. The cold, unfeeling gaze of the winter turned away from the empty alleys and fixed itself directly upon the ancient, stone walls of the church. Deep beneath the earth, in the quiet, damp embrace of the catacombs, the candles continued to flicker softly, casting their warm, golden light across the sleeping faces of Jan, Josef, and their brothers. They rested peacefully in the dark, wrapped in the profound comfort of their shared sanctuary, completely unaware that the heavy wooden doors far above them were about to be tested, and that the long, terrifying night they had tried so hard to escape was finally coming down the stairs. There is a gentle, quiet mercy in the way water eventually smooths even the sharpest of stones. If you have ever sat by the edge of a deep, still lake in the hours just before the dawn, you know the profound, heavy peace that water can bring. It absorbs the noise of the world. It covers the jagged edges of the earth in a dark, reflective blanket, turning the chaotic landscape into a mirror for the silent stars. Deep beneath the ancient, stone floors of the church, and the hidden catacombs where the air smelled of damp earth and old incense, the young men were about to be returned to that profound, watery stillness. The betrayal had finally led the shadow to the heavy wooden doors of the sanctuary. Far above their heads, the beautiful, sunlit morning of the Golden City was being torn apart. The men of ice had surrounded the church, bringing with them the terrifying, deafening roar of their anger. The air above was thick with the smoke of broken glass and splintered wood, echoing with the chaotic, violent sounds of a world entirely consumed by its own wrath. But down in the crypt, separated from the storm by layers of thick, unyielding bedrock, the noise was reduced to a distant, muffled vibration. It felt like the heavy, rhythmic heartbeat of a frightened giant. Jan and Josef, along with their brothers of the dark, sat in the flickering, amber light of their final candles. They felt the dust fall softly from the arched ceiling as the explosions rocked the nave above them. They looked at one another in the dim, golden glow. There was no panic in their eyes. The frantic, rushing adrenaline of the winding alleyways had long since burned away, leaving behind a pure, concentrated core of absolute calm. When you have spent months walking on the very edge of a precipice, carrying the crushing weight of an entire nation on your shoulders, the realization that the long journey has finally reached its end brings a strange, sweeping relief. The terrible, agonizing burden of the waiting was over. They did not have to run anymore. They did not have to hide in the shadows, listening to the wail of the sirens. They had found their final resting place, and they were entirely at peace with the stone walls that surrounded them. The shadow, realizing that the thick stone of the catacombs could not be easily broken by force, decided to use the very element of life as a weapon of the dark. They brought heavy hoses to the small, iron-grated windows that offered the crypt its only breath of air. At first, it was just a sound. A sudden, rushing hiss that echoed strangely down the narrow, vaulted corridors. And then, the first cold drops began to fall. It poured through the narrow openings, cascading down the ancient stone walls like a sudden, heavy rainfall. The water gathered on the uneven floor, a dark, creeping tide that slowly began to spread across the worn flagstones. It caught the reflection of the dying candles, turning the floor into a shimmering, shifting mosaic of gold and absolute black. The water was freezing. It carried the bitter, biting chill of the deep river, a stark contrast to the warm, human breath of the men gathered in the tomb. It seeped through the leather of their boots, a slow, icy warning that the absolute winter had finally breached their sanctuary. The men did not scream. They did not thrash against the rising tide. They moved with a slow, deliberate dignity, retreating deeper into the catacombs, seeking the higher alcoves carved into the ancient limestone. Watch them in the fading light. Watch how they move not as desperate, hunted animals, but as a deeply devoted brotherhood. When the water rose to their knees, making the heavy wool of their trousers cling like freezing lead, Jan reached out his hand to pull a younger friend up onto a stone ledge. He did not pull with frantic haste. He hoisted him up with a firm, steady grace, patting his shoulder once he was safe on the higher ground. They were sharing the last, precious islands of dry earth, holding onto their profound humanity even as the world literally sank beneath them. The water continued its slow, methodical climb. It covered the abandoned blankets. It swallowed the small, woven baskets that had held their meager rations of bread. One by one, the lower candles hissed and extinguished as the dark tide reached their wicks, plunging more and more of the crypt into an impenetrable, velvety blackness. As the cold water rose to their waists, a remarkable, beautiful thing happened. The physical world, with its freezing temperatures and its terrifying reality, began to slowly fade away. The mind, when faced with an inescapable, overwhelming ending, often retreats to the warmest, safest rooms of its own memory. Standing in the freezing dark, Yosef closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the damp, curved ceiling of the alcove. He did not feel the ice against his skin. Instead, he felt the warm, golden sun of a late summer afternoon in the rolling hills of his youth. He smelled the sweet, dry scent of hay drying in the fields. He saw his mother standing in the doorway of their modest home, wiping her hands on her apron, calling his name across the distance. A soft, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. He was already beginning his journey home. Beside him, Jan stood quietly in the rising water. He thought of the small, white envelope locked away in the drawer in the English countryside. He hoped, with a gentle, aching tenderness, that when his family finally read his words, they would not weep with a bitter, inconsolable sorrow. He hoped they would understand that he had given his life not out of hatred for the dark, but out of a fierce, boundless love for the light. He had carried the spark as far as he possibly could, and he was leaving the world a little warmer than he had found it. The water reached their chests. The breathing space in the catacombs was growing terrifyingly small. The air was thick, heavy, and freezing cold, carrying the hollow, echoing sound of the rushing water and the distant, muffled thuds of the world above. Only a single, solitary candle remained, resting on the highest ledge. It cast a faint, trembling halo of light across the faces of the men. They were pale, exhausted, and shivering, but their eyes were incredibly bright. In that final, flickering glow, they looked at one another one last time. There is a communication that happens in the absolute dark that requires no words. It is a transmission of the soul. Jan looked at Yosef. The boy from the fields, the brother of the mist, the thread that had been woven so tightly with his own. They had shared the quiet cups of tea. They had shared the terrifying fall through the night sky. They had shared the heavy, shattering weight of the explosion on the sunlit curve. And now, they were sharing the final, peaceful embrace of the earth. We did not break, that silent glance said. We held the bridge. The shadow above believed that by drowning them in the dark, they were winning a victory of terror. The men of ice believed that death was the ultimate punishment, the final, terrifying tool to force the human spirit into submission. But the men in the crypt knew a profound, beautiful secret. They knew that true freedom is not the absence of walls, nor is it the absence of water. True freedom is the absolute, unbreakable ownership of your own soul. The tyrant could take their breath, he could take their future, but he could never, ever take their dignity. He could never force them to surrender their love for their people. The water continued to rise, reaching the tops of their shoulders. The cold was a heavy, numbing weight, pulling them gently downward. They made their final choice. They would not allow the men of ice to pull them from the water as broken trophies. They would not give the absolute winter the satisfaction of claiming their lives. They had lived entirely on their own terms, guided by a fierce, protective love, and they would leave the world in the exact same way. The final candle gave a small, desperate sputter, and then the water swallowed the flame. The crypt was plunged into a complete, absolute, and perfect blackness. In the dark, there was no fear. There was only the gentle, rhythmic sound of the water lapping against the ancient limestone. Jan reached out his cold, trembling hand beneath the water, searching through the dark. Yosef's hand met his. their fingers intertwined, a firm, unbreakable grip holding tight against the rising tide. It was a touch of profound, overwhelming comfort. It was the physical promise that they were not walking into the unknown alone. They were brothers, tethered together at the very end of the world. There was a sudden, sharp, echoing crack in the dark. And then, another. The sounds were incredibly small against the vast, heavy silence of the earth. They were not sounds of violence. They were the sounds of a final, beautiful release. They were the sounds of chains breaking, of heavy doors opening, of tired, beautiful souls stepping out of their freezing bodies and walking freely into the warm, golden light of their own memories. And then, the crypt was completely, profoundly silent once again. The water, having finished its slow, relentless climb, finally stilled. The rushing hiss stopped. The heavy, dark tide settled into a perfect, glassy calm, filling the catacombs from wall to wall. It became a heavy, protective blanket, wrapping the fallen men in a silent, eternal embrace. The noise of the world above, the sirens, the shouting, the endless, grinding machinery of the war, could no longer reach them. They were safe. They were completely, untouchably safe, cradled in the deep, cold arms of the earth they had loved so fiercely. The storm would continue to rage outside. The weeping valleys would mourn, the invisible bridges would tremble, and the golden city would endure the long, heavy years of the shadow. But beneath the stone, resting in the quiet, absolute peace of the dark water, the young men slept. They had cast their spark. They had broken the glass. And now, their long, terrifying journey was over. The chill wind could no longer bite at their faces. The heavy burden had finally been lifted from their young shoulders. They were resting, shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, perfectly still and entirely unbroken, waiting with infinite patience for the true and final spring to arrive. There is a gentle, enduring promise in the way the sun always, eventually, rises to warm the cold stone. When a long and terrible winter finally breaks, the earth does not heal all at once. The ice does not vanish in a single afternoon, and the flowers do not immediately burst from the frozen soil. The return of peace is a slow, quiet, and deeply cautious thing. It arrives like a timid bird, landing softly on the windowsill, waiting to see if it is truly safe to sing. In the golden city of Prague, the lifting of the shadow did not happen overnight. Even after the armies had marched away and the heavy, mechanical roar of the occupation had finally faded into the distance, the people still carried the winter inside them. For a long time, mothers still instinctively reached to draw the heavy blackout curtains when the twilight fell. Fathers still spoke in hushed, careful tones when sitting around the dinner table. When the sudden, sharp chime of a tram bell rang out across the cobblestones, shoulders would still flinch, anticipating a terror that was no longer there. The body remembers the cold, even when the mind knows the fire has been lit. But time, with its infinite, patient grace, is the greatest healer of all. Watch the city as the years slowly begin to turn, like the beautiful, complex gears of the ancient astronomical clock. Watch as the days bleed into months, and the months soften into decades. Very softly, very gently, the city began to exhale. It was a breath that had been held in the dark for years. People began to leave their curtains open, allowing the warm, golden light of the late afternoon to spill across their faded rugs. The cafes reopened their heavy wooden doors, and the glorious, chaotic symphony of clinking glasses, bright laughter, and passionate debate returned to the squares. The grand pianos were uncovered, the dust was gently wiped from their polished lids, and the music, the beautiful, soaring, weeping soul of the city, finally spilled freely from the open windows once again. The children who had learned to play their silent games on the rugs of hidden apartments grew up. They grew into young men and women who walked the avenues without fear, their heads held high, their voices carrying easily on the wind. And eventually, their hair turned silver, and their hands grew soft and lined with age. They became the grandmothers and grandfathers sitting on the park benches under the blooming chestnut trees, watching their own grandchildren run across the grass. When those children ran too fast and scraped their knees, the grandparents would gently gather them up, wiping away their tears. And sometimes, in those quiet moments, they would think of the young men who had fallen from the freezing sky. They would think of the boys who had given up their own futures so that these children could run freely in the sun. The grandmothers would stroke the hair of their grandchildren and hum a soft, ancient melody, passing the enduring light of their people down through the generations, a quiet, unbroken chain of love. The physical scars of the city also began to soften. Think of the curve in the road. The sharp, sweeping bend where the stopped clock shattered and the winter was finally pierced. If you were to walk down that avenue today, on a bright and peaceful morning, you might not even notice it. It looks like any other street in a beautiful, bustling European city. The dark, rushing water of the river still flows nearby. The trams still grind along their metal rails, their bells ringing out clear and bright. People walk past holding cups of hot coffee, carrying bags of fresh bread, rushing to work or strolling leisurely with a friend. It is entirely ordinary. And that ordinary beauty is the most magnificent, earth-shattering victory imaginable. Jan and Josef did not stand on that corner to build a monument to war. They stood there to buy back the right to an ordinary Tuesday morning. They gave everything they had so that a young woman could buy a bouquet of wildflowers and walk down the street without looking over her shoulder. Every single mundane, peaceful moment that happens on that curve today is a living, breathing tribute to their sacrifice. And what of the church? What of the ancient stone walls that held the final, flickering candles in the dark? The catacombs are no longer filled with freezing water. The damp, heavy air of the tomb has been cleared. Today, if you walk down those narrow, winding stone steps, descending out of the reach of the sun, you enter a sanctuary of profound, overwhelming peace. The air is cool and still, smelling faintly of old stone and memory. The silence here is not the heavy, terrifying silence of a city holding its breath. It is the holy, comforting silence of a resting place. If you look closely at the walls, you can still see the scars. You can see the deep, jagged marks in the stone where the absolute winter tried to break in. But the stone held. The earth protected its children. Today, those marks are not wounds of terror. They are badges of an unbreakable spirit. Visitors come from all over the world, stepping softly across the uneven flagstones. They do not come to look at the dark. They come to honor the light. They bring small, flickering candles, placing them gently in the alcoves, filling the crypt once again with a warm, golden glow. They bring flowers, bright red roses, delicate white lilies, soft pink carnations, laying them softly on the ground, a vibrant, living contrast to the gray limestone. People stand in the dim light, and they simply close their eyes. They feel the profound, enduring courage that soaked into the very bedrock of this place. They touch their fingers gently to the cold stone, offering a silent, whispering prayer across the decades. Thank you, the whispers say. Asterisk, thank you for the spark. Thank you for holding the bridge in the dark, asterisk. And far away, across the rolling hills and across the wide, restless sea, there is the final chapter of the letters. Years after the heavy wooden doors of the crypt had closed for the last time, when the world had finally begun to stitch itself back together, the keeper of the letters in the damp English countryside opened his dark drawer. He took out the plain, white envelopes that had been waiting so patiently in the silence. Imagine the journey of those fragile pieces of paper. They traveled across the newly liberated continent, carried by trains and postal workers, making their way back to the golden fields and the deep forests of the homeland. Imagine a mother, her hair now entirely white, sitting by the window of her farmhouse. The war has taken so much from her, leaving a deep, hollow ache that she has learned to carry with a quiet, stubborn grace. A postman walks up the dirt path and places a weathered envelope in her hands. She looks at the handwriting. It is careful, neat, and impossibly familiar. It is the handwriting of her son. The boy who loved the spring. The boy who was afraid of the dark, but who walked into it anyway. Her hands tremble as she carefully breaks the seal. She unfolds the paper, her vision blurring with sudden, heavy tears. But as she reads the words, a strange, sweeping warmth fills her chest. I am safe, the letter says, written by a boy sitting by a fire in a foreign land, trying to build a bridge of ink across the ocean. Think of me when the first leaves of spring appear. The tears that fall onto the paper are not tears of bitter, inconsolable ruin. They are tears of profound, overwhelming love. She realizes that her son did not vanish into the void. He became the very soil of the nation. He became the wind that moves through the apple trees. He became the quiet, protective shadow that watches over the children playing in the sun. The letter is a physical tether to his heart, a final, beautiful embrace that time and winter could never destroy. She folds the letter, presses it gently to her heart, and looks out the window at the blooming world, finally able to let him rest. The true legacy of the spark is not found in the history books, with their heavy dates and their cold, rigid facts. The true legacy is found in the soft, unseen architecture of the human spirit. It is found in the understanding that the most powerful force in the world is not polished glass, nor is it the heavy iron of a machine. The most powerful force is the quiet, everyday heroism of an ordinary heart. It is the mother who waters down her soup to feed a stranger. It is the father who sits trembling by the door, keeping watch over the sleeping house. It is the elderly woman who wipes the dust from a terrified boy's cheek and offers him a moment of grace. These are the invisible bridges that hold the world together when it threatens to fall apart. And Jan and Josef, the two threads who fell from the freezing sky, they were simply the bright, burning culmination of all that quiet love. They did not fight alone. They carried the warmth of 1,000 hidden hearths in their pockets. They struck the match, but it was the enduring, unbreakable kindness of their people that provided the fuel. The night has finally ended. The absolute winter is a memory, fading softly into the pages of the past. If you were to stand on a high hill overlooking Prague tonight, just as the sun dips below the horizon, you would see a city of breathtaking peace. The sky turns a deep, velvety indigo. The ancient spires reach up toward the first, pale stars, their silhouettes sharp and beautiful against the fading light. The river Vltava winds through the valley, reflecting the warm, glowing lights of the bridges and the homes lining its banks. It is a city that knows the true value of its own heartbeat. It is a city that remembers the dark, and therefore, cherishes the light with a fierce, profound devotion. As the quiet morning sun rises each day, it touches the cobblestones, the high rooftops, and the gentle, rolling hills. It warms the bronze faces of the statues and the soft, green leaves of the chestnut trees. It is a slow, steady, and eternal promise. The ghosts of the dark have been laid to rest. The boys from the country, the brothers of the mist, are sleeping peacefully beneath the earth, completely enfolded in the deep, unyielding love of the home they saved. Their fears are gone. Their heavy burden has been lifted. They are safe now, held forever in the warm, golden embrace of history. Close your eyes and listen to the gentle breathing of the free world. It is the sound of 1,000,000 ordinary lives, continuing their beautiful, mundane journeys in the sunlight. It is the soft rustle of wind in the trees, the quiet hum of a lullaby in a distant room, the slow, steady turning of the earth. The fire is warm, the curtains are open, and the long, terrifying night is finally, truly over. Sleep well, Golden City. The sun has returned, and you are entirely, beautifully safe.